When the lamps were lit along the winding streets of Rome, and the bustle of the day gave way to a softer hum, the city seemed to breathe differently. The markets closed, the courts fell silent, and the voices of senators faded into the cool night. Yet even in these quieter hours, Rome did not release its grip on hierarchy. Power remained present, woven into every exchange, visible in every glance, and heavy in every silence. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the realm of sexuality. To the Romans, sex was never simply about desire or affection or private intimacy. It was a language, a public statement that conveyed dominance, subordination, and place within the social order. Just as the toga marked citizenship and the laurel wreath signaled triumph, the sexual role one occupied defined status, reputation, and honor. For a Roman man, his dignity did not rest on whether he loved women or men. It rested on whether he dominated or submitted. The act itself mattered far less than the role performed within it. A man who penetrated, who imposed his will, preserved his identity as a citizen, a soldier, and a leader. But the man who received, even if only once, risked the collapse of everything. His voice, his command, his standing in the Senate or the Legion could all unravel under the weight of that perception. This rigid understanding of roles reflected Rome's obsession with conquest. On the battlefield, victory was measured by who stood and who fell. In the political arena, triumph came from commanding the debate, silencing rivals with words as sharp as steel. In the household, the paterfamilias, the father of the family, held absolute control over wife, children, and slaves. And in the bedroom, that same expectation carried forward. The Roman man conquered, and in doing so affirmed his belonging to the structure that ruled the empire. It is telling that Roman law had little to say about affection, mutual pleasure, or consent. These concepts were faint, almost invisible in the legal codes. Instead, the focus remained on protecting hierarchy. Adultery was forbidden not because of love betrayed, but because it threatened a man's honor and a family's reputation. Sexual passivity in a freeborn male was not condemned as a private choice, but as a public weakness, a failure to embody the strength demanded by the state. One can imagine the pressure this placed on daily life. At a banquet with wine flowing and conversation lively, a man could not relax entirely. Every gesture was noticed. The way he reclined on his couch, the tone of his laughter, the way his eyes met another's. All of these details fed into the unspoken judgment of peers. To appear too tender, too yielding, too indulgent, risked whispers that spread like fire in the dry air of the city. Gossip was as dangerous as a sword. A single rumor could undo years of carefully maintained authority. Even the arts reinforced this constant vigilance. Public statues of emperors and generals showed firm torsos, stern faces, and disciplined stances. These were not images of comfort or softness. They were monuments to the idea that strength was virtue and that discipline of the body reflected discipline of the state. To see such statues in the forum or at the gates of temples was to be reminded daily that Rome valued control above all else. This devotion to control extended deeply into private households. The authority of the father was absolute, stretching from financial decisions to the intimate details of daily life. A daughter's reputation reflected on her father. A wife's conduct was seen as the mirror of her husband's honor. Even slaves, though considered property, were bound into this structure. Their obedience was not merely expected, it was demanded as proof of the master's power. Any sign of laxity, any appearance of weakness was seen not as the fault of the subordinate, but as evidence of failure in the one who ruled over them. Thus, the household became another stage upon which Roman masculinity was performed. A wife's modesty and silence, a daughter's obedience, a slave's compliance. Each was woven into the fabric of male dignity. In the same way that senators guarded their reputations in the forum, fathers guarded theirs at the family hearth. The boundary between public and private was porous, for in Rome, even the most intimate acts carried political weight. The language of power was relentless. If a Roman man desired a partner of lower status, whether a slave or a prostitute, society looked away. His role as the dominant actor preserved his place. But if that same man were seen to submit, if whispers suggested that he yielded in the bedroom, Then the city judged him harshly. Submission was not merely personal, it was a public disgrace. It is worth pausing to consider how exhausting this must have been. In a culture that demanded constant performance, there was little room for genuine tenderness or vulnerability. To relax to reveal softness was to risk suspicion. The very act of intimacy, which in other times and places might have been a space for trust, became instead another arena of vigilance. Picture a Roman evening, the torches burn. Low shadows stretch along marble walls, and a man reclines with companions in the triclinium, the dining hall. The laughter is loud, the gestures wide, yet beneath it all lies a shared understanding. None of this is free. Every smile, every joke, every story told carries weight. And behind the facade of ease, each man calculates how he appears, whether his posture remains firm, whether his role as conqueror is still clear. Such was the Roman way of binding desire to power. It was not affection that mattered, nor the private connection of two souls, but the affirmation of dominance. Even in love, Rome demanded hierarchy. Even in passion, Rome required order. The city that conquered the Mediterranean applied the same logic to its citizens' most personal acts: always ascend, never yield. As the night deepened and the city quieted, the truth remained. Rome did not sleep. Its eyes were everywhere, in the Senate, in the streets, in the whispers that curled through porticos and markets. And for every Roman man, the performance never ended. Sex, like politics, like war, was another language of power. The city of Rome rose from conquest and conquest, shaped every corner of its identity. From the earliest battles against rival tribes on the Italian peninsula, to the grand campaigns that carried legions across seas and deserts, victory defined Roman greatness. And yet the hunger to conquer did not end at the borders of provinces or on distant battlefields. It seeped into homes, into laws, into the most private acts of life. For the Romans, to be a man was to conquer. To hesitate to yield was to risk everything. In matters of sexuality, this principle echoed with unrelenting force. Roman masculinity was never measured by tenderness, nor by affection freely given or received. It was measured by control. To dominate was to affirm manhood. To be dominated was to forfeit it. Consent, as modern minds understand it, had little place in this system. The act of intimacy was not about two equal participants choosing one another, but about one asserting power, and the other being subject to it. Slavery made this logic visible. In a society where millions lived as property, their bodies became yet another arena for Roman control. A master's rights extended not only to the labor of his slaves, but also to their flesh. Male and female child or adult a slave had no claim to refusal. To resist was to invite punishment, and to submit was merely survival. Consent was never asked for because it was never considered necessary. The only concern was whether the master's role as conqueror remained intact in the eyes of his peers. This distinction explains why Roman law did not condemn sexual use of slaves, nor count it as adultery. A husband could take a slave into his bed and remain untarnished in reputation, for the act did not disturb the hierarchy. The wife might know, the household might see, but silence was the expectation. A slave, after all, did not belong to themselves. They belonged to the master body and all. The same logic governed relationships between men. A citizen could pursue intimacy with a slave boy or a freedman, and society looked away. So long as he remained the dominant partner, his dignity was secure. But should he allow himself to be penetrated, should he take the role of the subordinate, the consequences were severe. Ridicule was certain. Public disgrace could follow. In some cases, even punishment was possible, not for the act itself, but for failing to uphold the image of strength required of a freeborn Roman male. Such contradictions seem strange now, yet they were natural to the Roman mind. For them, it was not the nature of the act that mattered, but the direction of power. Who conquered? Who submitted? That was the only question worth asking. This obsession with conquest bled into the military, where discipline and masculinity were forged together. Roman soldiers could not afford to be seen as passive in any sense, whether in battle or in bed. To take the receptive role in sex was forbidden, not because of moral outrage, but because it was thought to erode the discipline of the army. A soldier who yielded in private, they believed, might falter in war. Thus, the legions enforced a rigid expectation: conquer in all things, or do not belong. Poets and satirists wielded this cultural weapon with precision. In verses sharp with mockery, men accused rivals of playing the passive role, whether true or not. Such jabs could wound reputations more deeply than steel. A line of poetry whispered in the streets or performed at a gathering could destroy the standing of a senator or philosopher. Sexual rumor was a political tool sharpened by the logic that to yield in bed was to yield everywhere. The household too bore this weight. A wife who strayed was not condemned for betraying affection, but for threatening her husband's honor. Her act reflected on him, for if he could not govern her, how could he govern anything else? In such a world, affection mattered less than control, and loyalty was measured not by love but by obedience. Imagine a Roman villa at dusk. The master walks through marble halls lit by flickering oil lamps. Behind him, servants move quietly, their eyes lowered. Somewhere in the women's quarters, his wife tends to domestic duties. In the slave rooms, boys and girls wait without expectation of choice. Each figure stands within a web of power, every thread pointing back to him. His dominance affirms his place in society. Their subordination confirms it. The house itself becomes a reflection of conquest. Each room a small battlefield where order is maintained by who commands and who obeys. This relentless structure left little space for affection. Moments of tenderness might have existed, but they were not celebrated. They did not appear in law or custom. What mattered was conquest, and in conquest, there could be no equals. Even the language Romans used reinforced this view. To conquer, to subdue, to possess, these were words that framed intimacy as war. For the enslaved, survival depended on understanding this code. Some sought to become favorites, aligning themselves closely with a master in the hope of better treatment. Yet even this position carried danger, for affection could invite jealousy or suspicion. A master who seemed too fond of a slave risked whispers of weakness, the very thing Roman men most feared. Thus, even the smallest kindnesses were weighed against the scale of public perception. This is the paradox of Rome, a society that conquered nations, built aqueducts, and codified laws, yet could not imagine intimacy without conquest. A world where consent was erased and power took its place, where every act, however private, echoed in the forum, the bathhouse, the senate, and the streets. The legacy of this culture is troubling, for it shows how deeply conquest can penetrate human life. In Rome, to be a man was to dominate, and to dominate was to belong. All else was silent submission and shame. And so, as the night deepened in the ancient city, the lesson remained unbroken. To love was to conquer, to desire was to command, and to yield was to fall not just in private, but in the eyes of all who watched. In the Roman world, being a man was not a condition one achieved once and kept forever. It was a role performed daily, a fragile status that could be reinforced or undermined with every gesture, every word, every rumor. Masculinity was less a birthright than a stage play, rehearsed, endlessly acted out before neighbors, colleagues, rivals, and even one's own family. The city itself provided the setting. Streets lined with marble columns, forums crowded with citizens, and baths filled with steam, all doubled as theaters where the smallest movements could carry heavy meaning. A man reclining at a banquet was not just resting, he was performing dominance. The angle of his body, the tone of his laughter, the way his hand lifted a cup. All of it was read by those around him. Roman masculinity was never private. It was a spectacle visible to all. Whispers traveled quickly. A slip of behavior, an appearance of softness, or a single suggestion of weakness could spiral into damaging gossip. Rivals thrived on such opportunities. A senator might spend years cultivating an image of stern authority, only to see it collapse overnight if someone spread the word that he had behaved too gently or yielded in ways considered unmanly. In Rome, laws were powerful, but rumor was stronger. The spoken word could unmake a career. Because of this, Roman men lived in constant awareness of their audience. They spoke in tones of command even in casual conversation. They moderated their gestures, ensuring no hint of delicacy betrayed them. They smiled with restraint, laughed with control, and never allowed themselves to appear unsure. The performance was relentless. Even silence was measured. To speak too much was to risk seeming frivolous. To speak too little was to risk appearing timid. Balance was everything. The Roman bathhouse exemplified this unending performance. There, men shed their clothes, but not their vigilance. Bodies were exposed, yet postures remained deliberate. A man might stand tall. Muscles flexed, voice firm, projecting an image of discipline, even in relaxation. Any sign of softness, a hesitant step, a lowered gaze, could invite ridicule. The bath was not just a place of cleansing, it was another arena where manhood was on display, another rehearsal in the lifelong play. Banquets, too, demanded careful acting. Reclining on couches, men feasted, drank, and debated. Yet beneath the surface of conviviality lay sharp attention. Who dominated the conversation? Who commanded the room with wit or story? Who leaned too close, laughed too freely, or appeared overly indulgent? The eyes of guests were never idle. Each man was both performer and critic, watching, judging, whispering. A moment of excess could become fodder for satire. A flicker of hesitation could become a weapon in political rivalry. Writers of the time understood this dynamic well. Poets and satirists wielded their pens like daggers, cutting reputations with verses that mocked softness or hinted at submissive roles in bed. These accusations were rarely about private pleasure, they were about public image. To suggest that a man had yielded was to strip him of the very thing Rome demanded his authority. Words on parchment recited aloud at gatherings could carry the force of a verdict. The audience laughed, but the target's dignity was shattered. Even the household reflected this stagecraft. A wife's conduct, a daughter's obedience, and a slave's compliance all served as props in the performance of male authority. If a woman acted improperly, blame fell not on her but on her guardian. It was the husband or father whose image suffered. Control, therefore, had to be visible. A household that appeared disciplined reflected a man who appeared strong. To fail in this theater was to risk whispers that spread far beyond the walls of the home. The constant scrutiny bred a culture of masks. Men learned to hide softness, to bury tenderness, to disguise vulnerability. To show affection openly risked suspicion. To relax in intimacy invited gossip. Thus the Roman man carried his armor into every chamber, every conversation, every moment of life. Love itself was performed as command. Friendship was demonstrated as alliance. Even leisure was staged as proof of dominance. It is difficult from the quiet of modern reflection to imagine the weight of this endless performance. Yet for the Romans, it was as natural as breathing. Children grew up observing their fathers, learning early how to project control. Boys were taught to stand firm, to speak boldly, to mask hesitation. By the time they reached manhood, the performance was second nature, ingrained so deeply that they could not separate self from stage. Still, cracks must have appeared. Behind closed doors and rare moments of privacy, perhaps some allowed the mask to slip. A man weary from the forum or the field might sigh with exhaustion, admit to fear, or long for tenderness. Yet even these moments were dangerous, for servants observed, wives remembered, and the city always listened. Privacy was never absolute. Rome's walls were porous and its people eager for stories. The performance of manhood then was not just for oneself, it was for the empire. To maintain authority at home and abroad, Rome required its men to embody dominance. Weakness in one man threatened the perception of strength in all. The empire built on conquest could not tolerate signs of yielding, even in matters as personal as laughter or love. And so, day after day, Roman men rehearsed and repeated their roles. In the forum, they stood tall, speaking with force. In the baths, they carried themselves with deliberate control. At banquets, they commanded with wit. At home, they ruled with authority. Every gesture, every word, every silence became part of the script. When night fell and the city quieted, the performance did not end. a man carried it into his chambers, into his bed, into his dreams. For in Rome, masculinity was never just a private truth. It was a public play, performed endlessly, judged without mercy, and remembered without forgiveness. The Roman home was more than a shelter of stone and plaster. It was a theater, a microcosm of the empire itself, where roles were defined, rules were enforced, and every member of the household contributed to the performance of authority. At its center stood the paterfamilias, the father of the family, whose power extended into every room across every life beneath his roof. His authority was not symbolic, it was absolute. The paterfamilias could arrange marriages, control finances, decide matters of life and death, and claim full command over wives, children, and slaves. To the Romans, this was not merely domestic order, it was the foundation of the state. The home was the smallest unit of the empire, and the man who could govern his household well was seen as fit to govern in public life. Every gesture within the household reflected this hierarchy. A daughter's modesty was her father's honor. A wife's silence and obedience were her husband's dignity. A slave's submission was proof of the master's strength. When a woman failed in her expected role, when a child spoke too boldly, or when a slave resisted the dishonor, did not rest solely on them. It fell on the paterfamilias whose authority had been questioned by the very people he was supposed to control. Thus the household became a stage where reputation was rehearsed daily. Just as the forum demanded speeches and the battlefield demanded victories, the home demanded constant displays of command. Visitors, neighbors, and servants all formed the audience. What they saw in the household shaped how they judged the man in the streets. Imagine stepping into a Roman villa. The atrium opened wide with a pool of water in the center reflecting the sky. Around it stretched corridors leading to private chambers, storerooms, and workspaces. Slaves moved quietly, eyes lowered, careful not to disrupt the order. A wife supervised domestic tasks, yet remained within boundaries set for her. Children were taught restraint, learning to avoid drawing attention. At every turn, the paterfamilias was present, even when silent, even when unseen. His will lingered in the air like the scent of oil lamps burning in the corners. This structure was not without affection, but affection was always framed by authority. A father might smile at his child, but the child's respect was expected above all. A husband might care for his wife, but her obedience was his due. Masters might show kindness to favored slaves, but such gestures were interpreted as strategy, not sentiment. To outsiders, these acts were not signs of softness, but of a man's skill in managing his household theater. The Romans believed that power at home and power in the state were inseparable. A man who lost control of his wife could not be trusted in the Senate. A father who failed to discipline his children could not command soldiers. Household order was thus a rehearsal for civic order. Every home mirrored the empire, one at the top, many below, and harmony maintained through hierarchy. Slaves in particular were critical to this stage. They worked, served, and attended to the family's needs, but they also observed. Their eyes carried stories beyond the walls. A careless word, a poorly timed outburst, or a moment of visible weakness could travel through whispers, undermining a master's reputation. For this reason, discipline was both practical and performative. To punish was to remind the household of the paterfamilias' strength. To pardon was to risk being perceived as weak. For women, the household stage was both a cage and a script. A wife's duty was to be modest, obedient, and fertile. Her silence was not just expected, it was demanded. Yet her behavior reflected directly on her husband's standing. If she appeared too free, too outspoken, or too bold, the shame was his. In this way, women carried the burden of their husbands' reputations, even though they had little power to shape their own. Children were drawn into the performance early. Sons were groomed to inherit authority learning, to command servants and carry themselves with restraint. Daughters were prepared for marriage, taught to be silent, modest, and loyal. Each step reinforced the larger play of the household as the training ground for Rome's next generation of rulers and subjects. But the stage was not always harmonious. Tensions simmered beneath the marble floors. Wives sometimes resisted in silence, finding subtle ways to express discontent. Slaves carried their own quiet rebellions, whether through small acts of defiance or whispered mockery. Even children bound by expectation must have felt the weight of performing obedience. Yet these struggles rarely broke the surface. The appearance of order mattered more than reality. This is what made the Roman household so striking. It was not simply a place of living. It was a stage of constant rehearsal where roles were fixed and performances judged. Every dinner, every conversation, every gesture reinforced the paterfamilias image. A well-run home projected strength to neighbors and peers. A disorderly one stained a man's honor before the city. The result was a society where private life could never truly be private. Even in the quiet of evening, when lamps flickered low and the sounds of the street faded, the performance continued. The paterfamilias authority stretched into the silence, shaping how wives spoke, how children moved, how slaves breathed in his presence. His dominance was not confined to public spaces. It lived in the smallest corners of his home. In Rome, to rule the household was to prove oneself worthy of ruling beyond it. The empire itself was built on this principle, replicated 1,000 times across its villas, insulae, and farms. Each home reflected the larger order control at the center, obedience at the edges, and power performed in every act, however small. Thus, the Roman household was not only a dwelling, it was a stage, a rehearsal hall, a mirror of the empire. Within its walls, reputations were made or broken. Honor was confirmed or lost, and the endless performance of manhood continued without pause. To be a Roman man was to live always under watchful eyes of family, of neighbors, of servants, and of history itself. In the Roman world, the body itself was never just flesh and bone. It was a canvas, a banner, a message carved into muscle and stone. To look upon the body of a Roman leader was to read a script of power, discipline, and authority. Every scar, every stance, every line of muscle was meant to tell a story. This man conquers, this man commands, this man embodies Rome. Public statues made this message unavoidable. Walk through the forum and you would see them rising above the crowd, bronze and marble figures of emperors, generals, and heroes. Their torsos were bare or clad in armor, their faces stern, their gazes fixed. These were not portraits of private men. They were symbols of the state itself. Strength was not shown as softness or comfort, but as control, tight lines, disciplined poses, unyielding expressions. The body was sculpted into an emblem of order, as necessary to Rome's image as its laws or temples. Even scars became part of this symbolism. A veteran's body carried marks of battle, reminders of conquest written on skin. For the soldier, these scars were not deformities, but proofs of service. They spoke silently of endurance, of victories won, of loyalty to Rome. To display them was to show devotion to the empire. To hide them was to risk appearing weak. The emperor's body in particular carried the weight of the empire's reputation. When Augustus stood before the people, he was not merely Augustus, he was Rome itself. His posture reassured citizens that the state was stable, his disciplined form, a reflection of the discipline he demanded from them. Later emperors followed this example, their bodies transformed into political tools. Nero might indulge privately, but in statues he stood like a conqueror. Hadrian might mourn Antinous, but in marble he appeared as a man untouched by sorrow. The physical image mattered more than the private truth. This emphasis on the body spilled into daily life. Ordinary men learned to carry themselves with firmness, to avoid movements that could be interpreted as weakness. A soft gait, a hesitant hand, or a gentle tone risked whispers. A Roman was expected to move as though the eyes of the empire were always upon him. At banquets, he reclined in a manner that projected ease without indulgence. At the baths, he stood tall, never slouched. In the forum, his voice was steady, his gestures controlled. The performance of power was inscribed in posture. Even leisure reflected this symbolism. Athletic games and gladiatorial contests trained bodies, not just for strength, but for spectacle. The muscular gladiator became an object of both fear and admiration, a reminder of the empire's ability to discipline and dominate. His scars, his sweat, his hardened form were not private burdens. They were performances of Roman values consumed by cheering crowds. In every muscle flexed in the arena, citizens read reassurance that Rome's strength was unshaken. Women, too, were judged by the symbolism of their bodies, though in different ways. A wife's modest dress and reserved demeanor reflected her husband's honor. Her silence was proof of his control. A daughter's chastity was her father's reputation. For women, the body symbolized obedience, loyalty, and fertility. Their worth was not measured in scars or discipline, but in quiet conformity. Yet even this passivity was symbolic, a reminder that men ruled because women submitted. The contradiction was striking. Rome celebrated male bodies as active symbols of conquest, while reducing female bodies to passive emblems of virtue. Yet both roles served the same function to reinforce the hierarchy of power. The body, whether strong or silent, was never neutral. It always carried meaning. Art and architecture reinforced this lesson. Frescoes in villas, reliefs on triumphal arches, and carvings on coins all displayed disciplined bodies, men in armor, gods in command, women veiled and modest. These images surrounded Romans daily, shaping how they thought about strength, virtue, and order. Even in private homes, statues of gods like Apollo or Mars projected ideals of masculinity, firm, lean, untouched by hesitation. The message was simple but powerful. To govern Rome, one must govern the body. To display control over flesh was to demonstrate control over people. The state, the family, and the individual all reflected one another, bound by the same logic. Discipline preserved honor, and honor preserved Rome. But there was fragility in this system. The very need to symbolize strength made men vulnerable to accusations of weakness. A single rumor of softness could undo the image carved in marble. Satirists and rivals exploited this vulnerability, mocking leaders for indulgence, effeminacy, or lack of discipline. In this way, the body became both shield and target. To appear strong was to protect one's place. To appear weak was to invite ruin. Imagine again walking through the streets of Rome. On one side, a statue of an emperor towers above you, muscles sculpted. To perfection, gaze lifted toward eternity. On the other, a group of men pass by, their steps deliberate, their postures upright, each carrying himself as if under the same gaze. The message is clear: the emperor is Rome, but so too is every citizen who embodies its discipline. The city itself becomes a stage, its stones and statues, instructing its people in the art of performance. In this world, the body was never private property. It belonged to the empire, to the household, to the audience of neighbors and rivals. It carried meaning, whether in marble, in scars, or in silence. To be Roman was to live as a symbol, and the body was the script. Thus, the body in Rome was not just flesh, but politics. Not just movement, but performance. Not just life, but legacy. Every scar was a story. Every statue, a sermon. Every posture, a declaration that Rome ruled not only through armies and laws, but through the very way its people carried themselves. And so in the Roman world, to stand tall was not merely to stand. It was to embody an empire. In the grand tapestry of Roman life, women's bodies and choices were not their own. They were bound to the reputations of fathers, husbands, and sons. While men displayed their authority through conquest, discipline, and performance, women were expected to embody silence, modesty, and submission. The contrast was sharp, and the inequality was deliberate. From birth, a Roman woman's value was measured not in her accomplishments, but in her restraint. As a daughter, she represented her father's honor. As a wife, she was the mirror of her husband's dignity. Even as a mother, her children's behavior reflected on her ability to remain modest and obedient. A single misstep, real or imagined, could stain not just her, but her entire household. Men, by contrast, carried their reputations in their own bodies. A scar, a commanding stance, a loud voice in the forum, these projected strength and authority. Women had no such freedom. Their silence was their strength. Their invisibility was their virtue. To speak too boldly, to dress too brightly, or to laugh too loudly risked whispers of shame. The double standard was clear: men earned honor by being seen. Women preserved honor by remaining unseen. This expectation shaped every corner of women's lives. At home, wives were confined to the inner quarters, responsible for managing servants, weaving, and raising children. They moved quietly, avoiding the public eye whenever possible. If they stepped into public ceremonies, they did so veiled, modestly dressed, and often silent beside their husbands. Their presence was symbolic, a reminder of family order, but their voices rarely carried beyond the walls of the house. Yet their behavior carried enormous weight. If a wife was suspected of disloyalty, her husband bore the disgrace. If a daughter appeared too free, her father's authority was questioned. In this way, men's reputations were tethered to the conduct of women, but women themselves were denied the chance to define that conduct. They were responsible without power, judged without agency. The double standard grew sharper when it came to desire. Roman men were free to pursue sexual relationships outside of marriage, so long as they did so with partners of lower status slaves, prostitutes, or concubines. These acts carried no dishonor, for the man remained the dominant figure. Women, however, were bound to rigid fidelity. A wife's body was considered the property of her husband and her family. To stray even in rumor was to invite ruin. Punishments for female infidelity were harsh. A woman accused of adultery could be divorced, stripped of her dowry, exiled, or even mutilated. In some cases, her nose was cut off, a permanent mark of shame that ensured she would never remarry. By contrast, a husband's affairs were treated as natural, even expected. Literature of the time joked openly about male indulgence while condemning women with bitterness and cruelty. Imagine the atmosphere this created in Roman households. A man might spend his nights in banquets surrounded by companions and lovers while his wife remained secluded. Her movements monitored, her speech carefully measured. She lived within walls that were not only physical but social barriers erected by law, custom, and expectation. Even her smallest gestures were scrutinized. A glance could be misinterpreted, a smile could ignite gossip, and once a rumor began, it was difficult to silence. Still, women found ways to exist within this narrow corridor of virtue. Some expressed themselves through writing, leaving behind poetry and letters that reveal glimpses of their inner lives. Others hosted gatherings or salons, quietly shaping thought and conversation behind closed doors. But these acts were exceptions, fragile threads in a tapestry woven to keep them quiet. The inequality was not only cultural but also legal. Under Roman law, a woman's guardianship never truly ended. She passed from her father's authority to her husband's, and sometimes even into the control of her adult sons. At no point was she considered fully independent. Her voice in court was limited. Her choices in property were restricted. Even her body was framed as a vessel for her family's lineage, a role she was expected to fulfill silently and faithfully. The irony lay in how essential women were to the very structure that confined them. Without their chastity, marriages would lose their legitimacy. Without their fertility, lineages would collapse. Without their obedience, households would falter. Yet while they carried the weight of Rome's continuity, they were denied recognition in its public life. Their labor was invisible, their loyalty assumed, their silence demanded. The contrast between men and women was therefore not accidental, it was structural. Men proved themselves through action, women proved themselves through inaction. Men spoke loudly in forums, women whispered or did not speak at all. Men could err and recover, women could falter once and be ruined forever. And yet history whispers of those who resisted. There were women who dressed as men, who pursued their own lovers, who challenged expectations in ways that unsettled their peers. They were mocked in satire, condemned in law, or erased in silence, but their very presence suggests a quiet rebellion beneath the weight of the double standard. Still, for most, resistance was impossible. The risks were too great. A single accusation could strip away not only personal dignity, but also family honor. Husbands, fathers, and sons all bore the reflection of a woman's supposed failure. Thus, women were taught from girlhood that obedience was not just expected, but noble. To endure quietly was to protect not only themselves, but the men around them. The double standard then was not simply unfair. It was deliberate, a structure designed to maintain hierarchy. Men performed power in public, women performed virtue in private. Together, these performances reinforced the empire's order, ensuring that dominance flowed always from the same direction. In Rome, to be a man was to act. To be a woman was to refrain. The stage was never equal, and the script never changed. In the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, where millions lived not as citizens but as property, slavery became more than an economic engine. It was also a loophole and opening in the rigid moral codes that governed Roman life. For freeborn men bound by expectations of honor, discipline, and reputation, slavery offered a way to indulge desire without consequence. The enslaved body became the space where rules bent, where prohibitions dissolved, where the contradictions of Roman morality found their outlet. A Roman husband expected to guard the fidelity of his wife could turn freely to his slaves. The law did not call it adultery. Society did not condemn it. A soldier forbidden from showing weakness or yielding in bed could demand compliance from the slaves who followed his legion. No whispers threatened him. No accusations clung to his name. The system excused it because the enslaved were not considered equals. They were possessions, extensions of their master's will, expected to serve silently in every capacity. This acceptance revealed much about Roman values. It was not the act itself that defined morality, but the hierarchy within it. To conquer in war was glorious. To dominate in bed was expected. As long as the roles were clear, master above slave below society remained untroubled. The enslaved had no right to say no, and so the master's honor remained intact. Consent was erased by status, and status became the only measure that mattered. The scope of this exploitation was immense. In villas across Italy and crowded apartments of Rome, in the tents of military camps, slaves were present, not just as laborers, but as objects of desire. Boys and girls were selected, sometimes trained, sometimes purchased for their beauty. Some were kept close to the master, attending his meals, his baths, his bed. Others were summoned at will, used once and dismissed. In each case, their silence was assumed. To resist was to invite punishment, to submit was merely to survive. For wives, this reality was both painful and expected. Roman matrons knew their husbands turned to slaves. The practice was so normalized that to object would have seemed naive. What mattered was not the act but the discretion. A husband might lie with a slave in his own household while his wife remained in another room fully aware. Her duty was not to protest, but to preserve appearances. To complain was to risk being seen as disobedient or foolish, undermining her own reputation as a modest and loyal wife. Even the language Romans used revealed this mindset. Words for sexual use of slaves often blurred with words for labor or service, as if intimacy were just another task to be commanded. A slave might be ordered to fetch water, prepare a meal, or share a bed, all part of the same spectrum of obedience. Their humanity was obscured beneath the weight of function, their voices silenced by the assumption that property could not protest. In some households, the use of slaves was not hidden but displayed. Masters boasted of their access, turning their dominance into a performance for guests. At banquets, young male or female slaves might be paraded as symbols of wealth, their presence an unspoken promise of what the master could command. These displays blurred the line between hospitality and humiliation, reminding all who watched that power extended even into the most private acts. The army mirrored this same dynamic. Roman soldiers, celebrated for their discipline, carried with them slaves who served not only as laborers but as outlets for desire. Discipline applied to comrades, not to property. A soldier might be punished for engaging passively with another free man, but he could demand submission from a slave without fear. The empire's legions thus carried not just weapons and standards into conquered lands, but also this culture of sanctioned exploitation. For the enslaved, survival required adaptation. Some became favorites, aligning themselves with masters in hopes of gentler treatment. A favored boy or girl might receive better clothing, lighter duties, or more leniency. Yet this position was fragile. Favor could turn to jealousy, tenderness to suspicion. indulgence to punishment. The enslaved lived on shifting ground. Their bodies both shield and target their fates, determined not by their choices but by the whims of those who owned them. This loophole also created a strange form of hypocrisy. Roman men could condemn indulgence in others while indulging themselves freely. They could scorn rivals with accusations of weakness, even as they demanded the submission of their own slaves. The contradiction was never hidden because society accepted it. What mattered was not consistency but hierarchy. As long as dominance flowed downward, the system justified itself. One might imagine the quiet despair that haunted the enslaved in these households. By day they labored in kitchens, fields, or workshops. By night they were summoned without warning, their bodies no longer their own. The walls of Roman villas still standing in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum once contained these silent struggles. Beneath frescoes of gods and heroes, beneath ceilings painted with myths of conquest, lived men and women whose lives told a different story of endurance, of submission, of survival, under a system that left them no choice. The presence of slavery as a sexual loophole also reshaped Roman ideas of fidelity. A wife's body was her husband's possession, bound by strict codes. But a husband's body was his own to use as he pleased, provided he chose partners of lower status. This double standard not only reinforced male dominance over women, but also blurred the line between marriage and ownership. For men, pleasure was freedom. For women, loyalty was law. And so slavery served as the hidden engine of Roman intimacy. It allowed men to indulge while preserving their reputations. It excused acts that would otherwise be condemned. It reinforced the hierarchy upon which the empire was built, conquerors above the conquered below in all things. When we look back now, the cruelty of this system is clear. Yet, to the Romans, it was ordinary, expected, unremarkable. Slavery was woven into every part of life, and the sexual domain was no exception. In the end, the loophole was not an accident. It was a deliberate feature of a society that valued dominance over compassion, hierarchy over humanity. In Rome, even desire was conquered. Even intimacy was chained. And the silence of the enslaved was the foundation upon which many freeborn reputations were built. The Roman household was more than a family home. It was a place of labor, ritual, and display where wealth and order were constantly measured. But hidden beneath the mosaics and marble behind the curtained doorways and torchlit corridors, the household was also a site of exploitation. The use of slaves for sexual purposes was not whispered about, not hidden with shame, but woven openly into daily life. To the Romans, this practice did not carry the stigma of infidelity or scandal. A master's access to the bodies of his slaves was treated as naturally as his right to their labor. Just as a slave might be ordered to fetch water or grind grain, so too might they be ordered into a bedchamber. The law looked away. Neighbors did not interfere. Wives were expected to endure it in silence. What would be condemned as betrayal in other contexts was within the Roman home an accepted extension of authority. In grand villas, this dynamic was especially visible. Wealthy men often kept boys and girls specifically for sexual use, a practice seen as a symbol of status rather than disgrace. These young slaves, chosen for beauty or pliability, were placed near their masters, attending to personal needs by day and summoned at night. Their presence reminded visitors not only of the household's wealth, but also of the paterfamilias' absolute control. Ownership extended to every part of their lives, including their most private selves. Wives lived within this arrangement, fully aware yet without recourse. Roman matrons were bound by law and custom to preserve appearances. They might see their husbands favor young attendants, might even pass them in the corridors, but they could not protest without risking their own reputations. Their silence was framed as loyalty, their endurance as virtue. The irony was cruel. Women were punished harshly for straying, while men indulged freely under the shelter of social approval. It was not the act itself that scandalized Romans, but the possibility of misplaced affection. A master could summon a slave as often as he pleased, but to show tenderness toward one was another matter. To appear emotionally attached blurred the line between ownership and intimacy. It raised whispers that the master was losing control, that he risked weakness by treating property as partner. Affection, not exploitation, carried the greater danger. And so slaves endured not only physical use, but also emotional erasure. They could be touched, but never loved. The household itself was arranged to sustain this system. Slaves lived in small, bare quarters, often near the master's chambers. Privacy was non-existent. At any moment, a knock or a summons could change the course of their night. To refuse was unthinkable. To resist invited punishment, beating, starvation, or worse. Submission was survival. Some learned to endure in silence while others tried to secure better treatment by becoming favorites, aligning themselves with their masters in the hope of protection. Yet, even this carried risk. Favor was fragile, subject to jealousy or suspicion. Children grew up watching these dynamics. Sons observed their father's authority over both women and slaves, learning early that masculinity meant command. Daughters watched their mother's silence, absorbing the lesson that loyalty meant endurance. In this way, the exploitation of slaves was not only tolerated but taught, passed from one generation to the next as part of the natural rhythm of household life. Visitors too became witnesses. At banquets, hosts sometimes flaunted their access to slaves, parading them as part of the evening's entertainment. A boy might pour wine with a glance meant to suggest more. A girl might sing dance or recline nearby a living emblem of the master's indulgence. Guests recognized these displays not as shameful but as affirmations of power. To host lavishly was to provide not only food and wine but also proof of authority over bodies. The casual acceptance of such exploitation reflected a deeper truth about Roman values. For freeborn men, sexuality was never about affection. It was about hierarchy. To dominate reinforced their place in society. To submit threatened it. Slaves stripped of rights existed at the bottom of this scale. Their lack of voice, their lack of agency became the very thing that safeguarded their master's honor. One might imagine the silence that filled those corridors at night. Oil lamps flickering against painted walls, shadows moving softly across mosaics of gods and myths. Beyond the beauty, in plain rooms with thin bedding slaves, waited uncertain when the summons would come. Their footsteps were hushed, their faces expressionless. Every sound carried risk. Every gesture had consequence. And yet, amid this silence, whispers must have passed slaves, sharing fragments of endurance, warning one another, perhaps dreaming of a life beyond these walls. History rarely records their voices, but their presence lingers in the background of Roman literature, in satire that mocked masters' indulgences and poems that hinted at hidden affairs and legal codes that spoke bluntly of property but never of people. For the masters, the lack of shame was itself a performance. By using slaves openly without apology, they projected confidence. By displaying control, they reaffirmed their place in the hierarchy. Exploitation became part of the household script, another scene in the endless performance of dominance. The consequences stretched far beyond the walls of any single villa. Rome itself, with its senators, generals, and emperors, was built on the labor and submission of the enslaved. The exploitation of bodies was not a private shame, but a public foundation. In this sense, the household mirrored the empire, both sustained themselves through conquest. Both thrived on subjugation. Both treated people as means to power, rather than as lives with worth. To us, the cruelty is vivid. To them, it was ordinary. The household was not a refuge from the empire's hunger for control. It was its most intimate expression. Slaves, wives, and children alike moved within its architecture, bound to the paterfamilias' will. Each act reinforcing the same truth that in Rome, exploitation was not hidden, and shame was reserved not for cruelty, but for weakness. And so the Roman home stood as both sanctuary and stage. Its frescoes glowed with color, its fountains sparkled in courtyards, its walls echoed with the footsteps of servants. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the beauty, beneath the marble, lived the quiet suffering of those who had no choice. Exploitation was not a secret. It was the very structure of daily life. In the world of Rome, consent was a word that scarcely existed. The framework of society was built not on agreements between equals, but on commands flowing downward. From emperor to senator, from senator to citizen, from master to slave, the same principle echoed authority. Decided subordinates obeyed. In the realm of intimacy, this order was no different. The enslaved carried the heaviest burden. Their bodies were not their own. Ownership meant that every part of their existence could be claimed: hands for labor, voices for commands, and flesh for desire. To refuse was not only impossible, it was unimaginable. The master's will defined reality, and resistance was answered with punishment swift and brutal. A whip across the back, a ration of food withheld, a beating behind closed doors. These were reminders that silence was the only safe response. Consent in this world was erased by design. A slave could not say yes, for their yes carried no freedom. A slave could not say no, for their no was a challenge to authority. Every interaction was framed not as choice, but as survival. To submit was to live another day. To resist was to risk destruction. The imbalance of power stripped meaning from tenderness. A master might convince himself that a favored slave cared for him, that loyalty sprang from affection rather than necessity. But beneath such illusions lay a harsher truth. Affection could not exist where refusal was impossible. The enslaved learned to act as though compliant sometimes, even as though willing because their safety depended on it. Survival demanded performance. This performance reached into every corner of the household. A slave girl ordered to a master's chamber might force a smile, knowing that tears would only invite harsher treatment. A boy summoned in the night might feign eagerness, aware that hesitation could mark him as disobedient. The veneer of consent was cultivated, but beneath it ran a river of silence. Each gesture, each word, each look was calculated, not freely given. For Roman society, this erasure was not troubling, it was convenient. By denying the enslaved the possibility of refusal, the system preserved the appearance of order. There were no scandals, no debates, no accusations of betrayal, because within the structure of slavery, choice was never acknowledged. A master's desire was justified by ownership, and ownership erased the very idea of consent. The legal system reinforced this silence. Roman law recognized slaves as property, not persons. Their testimony in court was not accepted unless extracted under torture, on the assumption that they would otherwise lie. Their bodies carried no legal protection, and their suffering no weight in the eyes of the state. If a master killed a slave, the law did not count it as murder, but as the destruction of property. In such a world, the idea that a slave's voice could matter in intimacy was unthinkable. This framework shaped the psychology of survival. The enslaved learned to navigate danger through subtlety, reading moods, anticipating commands, avoiding conflict. They became experts in silence, their lives a constant balance between endurance and erasure. The cruelty lay not only in the acts themselves, but in the way the system demanded the appearance of consent while denying its reality. Survival required not just submission, but performance of willingness. The hypocrisy of Roman values becomes striking in this light. Freeborn men obsessed with preserving their own dignity insisted that they never appear submissive. Yet they demanded submission from those who had no power to refuse. Masculinity was defined by dominance, but the dominance was maintained not against equals, but against those stripped of every defense. In this sense, Roman manhood fed itself on silence, requiring the erasure of others to sustain its performance. In households across the empire, the pattern repeated endlessly. Villas, insulae, and rural farms alike echoed with the same truths. Masters commanded, slaves endured, and consent was nowhere to be found. Some households flaunted their power openly, parading enslaved attendants as emblems of indulgence. Others kept such practices quiet or hidden behind walls. But the silence was always there, woven into daily life like the hum of the city streets. It is difficult to imagine the inner lives of the enslaved, for history rarely preserved their voices. We have fragments, lines from satire, mocking masters, scraps of graffiti, hinting at hidden suffering, passing mentions in legal texts. These glimpses remind us that behind the marble halls and golden mosaics lived men and women who bore the weight of silence. Their endurance was invisible, their survival unrecorded, their humanity overshadowed by the empire's hunger for dominance. And yet one can sense the unspoken resistance that survival required. Every day endured was a form of defiance. Hey, every whispered warning shared between slaves, every quiet act of care offered in darkened quarters, every small choice to live, despite erasure, was a testament to resilience. Survival in such a world was not passive. It was an act of quiet strength carried out beneath the gaze of those who claimed ownership. The Romans may not have recognized the absence of consent, but we can see it clearly now. The silence that filled their homes was not harmony. It was suppression. The smiles of slaves were not signs of affection. They were masks worn to preserve life in a system that denied choice. In the end, Rome's grandeur, the arches, the aqueducts, the marble halls was built not only by the labor of the enslaved, but also on the silence of their erasure. Consent was sacrificed to preserve the illusion of order, and survival became the only form of agency left. When night fell over the empire, when lamps flickered out and the city grew quiet, the performance continued. Masters dreamed of power, wives rehearsed obedience, and slaves endured the silence of survival. Consent had no place in that darkness. Only endurance remained. The streets of Rome were never truly silent. Even when the markets closed and the torches dimmed, whispers traveled through the alleys, weaving their way from taverns to temples, from bathhouses to the Senate itself. In this city, words carried as much weight as swords, and gossip was a weapon sharpened daily. Public satire fueled by rumor could elevate one man and ruin another, and in matters of intimacy, no subject was too private to escape its sting. The Roman obsession with performance meant that reputations were fragile. A man's honor depended not only on his actions, but on how others perceived them. Masculinity tied so closely to dominance could be questioned with a single insinuation. To suggest that a senator yielded where he should have commanded or submitted where he should have dominated was to place his entire identity on trial. And once whispered, such accusations spread quickly. Poets and satirists made careers out of this vulnerability. Writers like Martial and Juvenal filled their verses with barbs aimed at the powerful. They mocked philosophers for hypocrisy, senators for indulgence, generals for hidden lovers. Their words dripped with irony, yet their targets often felt the wounds as real. A clever poem recited at a banquet or copied onto a scrap of parchment could undo years of careful reputation building. In Rome, satire was not just art, it was politics. What made these attacks especially dangerous was the Roman fixation on roles. A freeborn man might lie with slaves or prostitutes without fear, but if satire suggested he had taken the submissive role, his dignity was undone. The act itself mattered less than the rumor. It was not the truth that destroyed reputations, but the performance of weakness assigned to them. Satirists knew this well, and wielded their pens accordingly. The bathhouses, forums, and markets served as stages where gossip thrived. Imagine a group of men reclining after a soak, trading stories of who had been seen entering whose home, or what servant had whispered of his master's indulgences. Such tales grew in the telling, embroidered with exaggerations, sharpened by rivalry. A senator might wake to find that his household secrets were already being laughed at across the city. No walls were thick enough to keep gossip out. Even emperors were not immune. Though their power was immense, their reputations were fragile in the face of public ridicule. Caligula and Nero, remembered for their extravagances, became targets of endless whispers. Some accounts may have been exaggerated, even invented, but the fact that people believed them mattered more than their accuracy. To say that an emperor indulged too freely or behaved too shamelessly was to plant seeds of doubt in the empire's foundation. Satire turned rumor into legacy, preserving slander in verse long after the subjects were gone. For women, gossip worked differently. Since their reputations were tied to silence and modesty, even the faintest whisper of impropriety could bring ruin. A wife accused of laughter too free of glances, too bold, risked her husband's honor along with her own. Neighbors, servants, and even relatives became participants in this surveillance, each story feeding the larger script of virtue or shame. Women were expected not only to live quietly, but also to avoid becoming subjects of talk. To be gossiped about was in itself a form of failure. The cruelty of this system lay in its indifference to truth. Gossip did not wait for proof. Satire did not need accuracy. Once a story took root, it was almost impossible to erase. A single clever verse could echo across generations, shaping how history remembered its subject. For the targets, denial was useless. To protest too loudly was to seem guilty. To remain silent was to allow the rumor to grow unchecked. This culture of gossip revealed Rome's unease with vulnerability. Men who prided themselves on dominance feared above all being seen as weak. Women bound by silence feared above all being noticed. Satire exploited these fears, turning them into entertainment for the public and ammunition for rivals. In this way, gossip was not just idle chatter. It was a tool of control, keeping everyone aware that their lives were subject to the judgment of others. Consider the role of slaves in this network. Living within households, they saw everything: the master's indulgences, the wife's silences, the children's rebellions. Though their voices carried little weight in courts, their whispers fed the undercurrent of rumor that shaped reputations. A servant's observation passed quietly to a neighbor or repeated in a market stall could become the spark for satire. Thus, the powerless contributed to the downfall of the powerful, not through rebellion but through words. The Romans understood this power of language deeply. They carved inscriptions into stone, recited poems in theaters, copied manuscripts across the empire. Words lasted. Gossip, once recorded in satire, outlived the men it mocked. A senator might spend his life striving for dignity, only to be remembered centuries later for a single insult penned by Martial. Such was the permanence of ridicule in a culture that prized performance. And so in Rome, intimacy was never truly private. The household, the forum, the bathhouse, all were stages upon which the play of reputation unfolded. Actions mattered, but so too did whispers, jokes, and lines of verse. Gossip and satire blurred the line between truth and performance, reminding every Roman that they lived not only under the gaze of the state, but also under the gaze of their peers. In the quiet of night, when lamps burned low and the city fell still, the echoes of gossip lingered. A man might recline on his couch, his eyes on the ceiling, replaying the words he had heard that day. Words that mocked, that hinted, that accused. He knew that by morning those words might travel farther, might appear in verse, might shape how he was seen forever. In this way, the Roman obsession with reputation created a city where no one was safe from words. Gossip was the shadow that followed every man's satire, the mirror that distorted every face. And together they ensured that in Rome the performance of life never ended, not even in silence. In Rome, women were always present but rarely heard. Their lives were lived in the shadows of the forum, behind the high walls of villas, within the quiet chambers of households. They moved through the empire like figures blurred at the edges of a painting, necessary, visible, yet seldom granted voices of their own. When Roman writers turned their pens toward women, they often did so not to preserve their experiences, but to use them as symbols of virtue, of temptation, of danger, or of silence. Literature from the period reveals this absence most clearly. Male poets wrote of women as curiosities, as adornments, or as cautionary tales. Satirists mocked women who strayed from expected roles, painting them as excessive, foolish, or dangerous. When female desire was acknowledged, it was either dismissed as trivial or framed as scandal. The result was a world where women's lives were filtered through the words of men who could not or would not capture them fully. Take, for example, the topic of female-female intimacy. Roman writers mentioned it only rarely, and when they did, it was with ridicule or dismissal. Lesbian relationships were treated as curiosities, written about more as jokes than as realities. The silence here is telling. Just because Roman men did not discuss it seriously does not mean such relationships did not exist. It means only that they were not seen as threatening, not important enough to be regulated, and therefore not worth preserving in detail. The absence is as revealing as any account. Women who defied expectations, who dressed as men who sought their own lovers, who lived with boldness, appeared in records only briefly, often through hostile eyes. They were mocked in satire reduced to insults or remembered as warnings. Their real voices are lost, buried beneath the interpretations of men who struggled to make sense of choices outside the norm. And yet, the very fact that such women were noticed at all suggests a deeper current of resistance. Even in silence, their presence disrupted the tidy narrative of obedience. The household, too, obscured women's stories. Wives were central to family life, bearing children, managing servants, and preserving honor. Yet their daily rhythms rarely appeared in the grand accounts of historians. Letters and poetry reveal fragments, hints of affection, glimpses of boredom, signs of quiet endurance, but the full texture of their lives is hidden. What did they whisper to one another in courtyards? How did they comfort daughters or guide sons? History gives us only shadows. Occasionally, women stepped briefly into the light of history, usually when they disrupted it. Julia, the daughter of Augustus, became infamous for her affairs. Roman writers preserved her story not to honor her courage, but to condemn her as a cautionary tale. Her exile was framed as proof of her father's moral resolve, not as a tragedy of a woman punished for daring to live beyond her role. Women like Julia remind us that silence was not always voluntary. It was enforced often brutally when women strayed beyond the script. Even when women gained influence, it was often hidden. A wife might guide her husband's decisions in private, or a mother might shape her son's ambitions quietly. These forms of power were informal, fragile, and easily erased by rumor or scandal. A single accusation could undo years of careful influence. Respect was never secure. Authority, when held, was shadowed by risk. The absence of women's voices in Roman records reveals the deeper logic of the empire. To acknowledge them fully would have meant acknowledging the limits of male control. It was easier instead to write them as background characters, their stories trimmed to fit the needs of men. Yet the fragments that survive, the poetry written under pseudonyms, the graffiti etched into walls, the rumors of women disguising themselves for freedom, hint at lives lived with more variety and defiance than the official accounts allow. Imagine walking through Pompeii before the eruption down streets, lined with houses where women moved quietly through courtyards, where wives prepared offerings to household gods, where young girls whispered in corners. None of these moments would make it into marble inscriptions or grand histories, yet they formed the pulse of Roman life. The empire might have been built by generals and senators, but it was sustained by women who endured, who adapted, who shaped households through labor invisible to history's eye. The silence of women in Roman records is not an absence of presence. It is an absence of recognition. They were there always, bearing children, weaving cloth, preparing food, tending fires, sharing stories in whispers. Their absence from the written record reflects not their insignificance, but the priorities of those who wrote. To the men who chronicled Rome, power was what mattered, and power was defined as male. Yet history is never fully obedient to its chroniclers. Even in records written by men, women's lives bleed through. The anxiety with which writers mocked bold women suggests their impact. The silence around female-female intimacy suggests its persistence. The harshness with which rebellious women were punished suggests that they were feared, not merely dismissed. In these gaps, we glimpse the outlines of lives lived outside the narrative. Rome was a city of stages, forums, theaters, bathhouses, households, all places where roles were performed and reputations measured. Women were often cast as silent players in these scripts, but silence is not absence. It is survival. Their stories may not fill the pages of history, but their presence shaped every corner of Roman life. Without them, households would falter, lineages would end, rituals would lose their rhythm. The empire itself, for all its grandeur, depended on women whose names we do not know. As night settled over Rome, lamps glowing faintly in courtyards, one can imagine the quiet conversations women shared in shadows. They may not have been recorded, but they were real. They carried wisdom, endurance, and perhaps even rebellion in whispers. Outside the grand narrative, women lived full lives that Rome chose not to remember, but which remained silent, yet enduring beneath the marble and ash. To understand Rome is to understand its strange equation. Dominance was virtue and submission was weakness. This belief colored every corner of the empire from the battlefield to the bedroom, from the Senate to the household courtyard. The Roman mind did not ask whether an act was kind or just or consensual. It asked only who was above and who was below. In that answer lay the measure of honor. This logic began in the body. For a freeborn Roman man, the greatest fear was not desire itself, but being seen as passive. To dominate was acceptable, even admirable. To be dominated, especially by another man, was disgrace. A citizen who yielded was mocked, whispered about, satirized in verse. His voice might still speak in the Senate, but it would carry less weight. His reputation might still stand, but it would lean under suspicion. Masculinity itself was tied to the refusal of submission. This rule stretched far beyond intimacy. On the battlefield, to dominate enemies was glorious. To submit was cowardice. In politics, to command was strength. To yield was shame. In the household, to rule firmly was noble. To falter was failure. The same equation, repeated endlessly, shaped Roman thought. Even in leisure, a man's bearing was measured for signs of dominance. To recline too lazily, to laugh too freely, to show tenderness too openly, these could be read as cracks in the armor of authority. What made this system powerful was its simplicity. Every act carried meaning. Every gesture, every rumor, every scar or lack of scar reflected back on a man's place in the hierarchy. The Roman world demanded constant performance, not of affection, but of control. Virtue was not measured in compassion, but in the ability to command, to stand above, to bend others to one's will. The household reflected this belief most intimately. The paterfamilias, the father of the family, ruled not only through law but through performance. His dominance over wife, children, and slaves was proof of his virtue. A quiet home was not evidence of peace, but of power exercised effectively. A wife's silence, a child's obedience, a slave's submission, all testified to the father's strength. To lose that order was not a private failing, it was a public shame. This obsession with dominance created paradoxes. A man could indulge with slaves, prostitutes, or concubines freely as long as he remained the active partner. But if whispers suggested he had taken a passive role even once his reputation cracked, he might command armies and govern provinces, but satire would reduce him to weakness. A single poem mocking his supposed submission could haunt him longer than victories remembered. In this sense, Roman morality was less about acts than about appearances. A freeborn man might exploit endlessly and still be praised. But if rumor placed him in the role of the submissive, no amount of conquest could restore him. The performance of dominance mattered more than reality. The fear of appearing weak drove men to guard their image, relentlessly avoiding gestures, relationships, or even words that might hint otherwise. Women, by contrast, were measured by the opposite standard. For them, submission was virtue, dominance a threat. A wife's obedience was praised, her assertiveness condemned. A daughter's silence was honorable, her boldness shameful. Where men earned honor by ruling, women preserved it by yielding. Together, these mirrored expectations reinforced the same hierarchy: men above, women below, always. The military codified this belief with particular severity. Roman soldiers were forbidden from taking passive roles in intimacy, not because of moral concerns, but because submission was seen as incompatible with discipline. A soldier who yielded was thought unfit to command, unworthy of Rome's armor. His body was expected to mirror the empire itself, unyielding, dominant, victorious. To falter was to betray not only oneself, but the legion, and by extension, Rome itself. Literature captured these tensions vividly. Satirists mocked senators accused of softness. Poets teased rivals for supposed indulgences. Rumor became a battlefield where reputations were defended with silence and lost with a single clever verse. Martial and Juvenal, with biting wit, reminded Romans that the greatest insult was not cruelty but weakness. Even emperors towering above all feared these whispers. Their marble statues projected strength, but their reputations could be pierced by satire as easily as any citizens. The fixation on dominance and virtue created a culture both powerful and fragile. It gave Rome its discipline, its armies, its sense of order. But it also bred hypocrisy and fear. Men who condemned indulgence indulged themselves privately. Leaders who demanded loyalty pursued pleasures unchecked. The need to appear unyielding left little room for tenderness, for affection, for honesty. Imagine a Roman evening lamps flickering in a villa's atrium. A master reclines on a couch speaking with measured authority. Around him, slaves move silently, a wife sits modestly apart. Children hover in obedience. The scene is orderly, impressive, a performance of power. But beneath it lies silence, desires, unspoken fears, suppressed affection stifled. The performance holds but only by erasing what did not fit the script. Dominance equaled virtue. Submission equaled weakness. It was a simple equation, but it shaped lives, marriages, armies, and politics. It sculpted marble statues, etched lines of poetry, and whispered through gossip in bathhouses. It demanded endless vigilance, endless rehearsal, endless silence. And it left little space for the softer truths of human life. For Rome, this was the cost of order, a world where power was virtue, weakness was shame, and every act was judged by who commanded and who obeyed. In such a system, dominance was not only expected, it was everything. In the world of ancient Rome, masculinity was not a fragile ideal to be whispered about, nor was it a simple matter of strength or appearance. It was a code, a set of unwritten rules that governed how men carried themselves in every arena of life, from the battlefield to the bedroom. Male-male relations, though present and even common, were framed entirely within this code. What mattered was not affection, not companionship, not tenderness. What mattered was who dominated and who yielded. To the Roman mind, a man's dignity remained intact so long as he played the active role. To penetrate was to command, to maintain the upper position, to embody power. But for a freeborn Roman male to accept the opposite role was another matter entirely. To be penetrated was to risk ridicule, suspicion, even disgrace. The act itself mattered less than the posture it implied. A submissive man was thought to surrender more than his body. He surrendered his honor, his authority, his claim to stand as a Roman among equals. This distinction shaped the way intimacy unfolded in Roman society. Relations between older men and younger companions were not unusual. Often, the younger partner was a slave or a freedman, someone of lower status whose role was clearly defined as subordinate. Such relationships were not hidden in shame. They could even be acknowledged openly so long as the hierarchy remained visible. For the older Roman, these encounters confirmed his dominance. For the younger, they confirmed his dependence. The double edge of this arrangement lay in how public it could become. Emperors themselves, standing as the pinnacle of Roman manhood, were not immune to its contradictions. Hadrian, remembered as a cultured and disciplined leader, openly cherished Antinous, a youth whose beauty captivated him. Their bond was more than whispered affection. It was carved into stone, minted into coins, enshrined in temples. When Antinous died, Hadrian mourned him so deeply that he ordered him deified, elevating him to divine status. Statues of the youth still stand today, their marble faces serene, their bodies sculpted with reverence usually reserved for gods. And yet, even in this act of devotion, Roman logic lingered. Antinous was remembered as beloved, but also as subordinate. His youth, his beauty, his lower station, all reinforced Hadrian's dominance even in grief. Tenderness could be expressed, but only within the framework of hierarchy. The emperor remained the commanding figure, the lover who bestowed divinity upon the one he had once possessed. The paradox is striking to modern eyes. We see in Hadrian's monuments evidence of love, of mourning, of a bond that crossed boundaries. But to Romans, the story was less about love than about power. To cherish was acceptable, but to yield was not. Masculinity was not measured by the presence of desire, but by the role played within it. This mindset stretched into satire and gossip just as it did with other aspects of Roman life. A man accused of yielding to another, especially if he was freeborn, became a target for ridicule. Poets sharpened their words into weapons mocking rivals with suggestions of weakness. The charge was not that a man sought pleasure that was expected, but that he sought it in the wrong way from the wrong position. To be the active partner was permissible. To be the passive one was ruin. In cities like Pompeii, this code of dominance appeared not only in whispers but in images. Frescoes and graffiti depicted scenes of male intimacy, sometimes playful, sometimes explicit. These images were not hidden in secret chambers, but displayed in homes, taverns, and even public spaces. To modern minds, their openness seems startling. But to Romans, they reflected life as it was lived, ordinary, visible, accepted, so long as roles were preserved. The meaning of these images often extended beyond pleasure. Some frescoes carried protective or ritual significance, invoking gods of fertility or warding off bad luck. In such cases, the act depicted was less important than the power it symbolized. Once again, dominance was equated with virtue, submission with vulnerability. The motto could almost be summed up as everything is permitted so long as the right person does it. This motto reveals both the freedom and the limits of Roman sexuality. On one hand, men of status could pursue a wide range of desires without fear of condemnation. On the other, their freedom depended on constant vigilance to avoid appearing weak. The boundary was not the act itself, but the role within it. Masculinity had to be guarded, performed, and proven even in the most private of encounters. The military reflected this logic with severity. Roman soldiers were forbidden from passive roles not because of moral objection, but because submission was thought incompatible with strength. A soldier's body, like his armor, was expected to stand firm, never yielding. To falter was to betray the discipline that bound legions together. Thus, even in matters of intimacy, the soldier was expected to mirror the empire itself, dominant, unyielding, unconquered. This constant equation of dominance with virtue bred a culture of both freedom and hypocrisy. Men could pursue pleasure widely so long as they remained on top. They could condemn others for the same acts they indulged in, provided they questioned the role their rivals played. They could display affection publicly, but only within the safe framework of hierarchy. Desire flowed freely, but always downstream of power. Imagine the atmosphere this created in the Roman home. An older man might recline at dinner, a favored youth nearby, their bond acknowledged but unspoken, their roles never questioned. Guests might see, might know, but would not object so long as the arrangement preserved the master's dignity. The household walls decorated with painted myths and carved gods silently reinforced the logic. Dominance equaled virtue, and virtue preserved Rome. And yet beneath this order one senses the lives of those who lived in its shadow. The youths, the slaves, the companions, they too carried stories. Though history rarely recorded them, their voices are missing, their choices erased their humanity, reduced to the roles Romans assigned them. The monuments to Antinous stand, but his own words are gone. The frescoes in Pompeii remain, but the lives of those depicted are lost. What survives is the Roman logic inscribed in art and law that even desire must bow to power. So it was that male-male relations in Rome unfolded not as acts of secret shame, but as performances of hierarchy. They reflected not love, but order, not tenderness, but control. And in this they tell us more about Rome than about desire itself. For in Rome, even intimacy was measured in the same terms as war and politics, who stood above and who bowed below. Among the paradoxes of Roman life was the curious presence of symbolic marriages between men. Though the empire never granted such unions legal weight, there are scattered records that describe ceremonies, some private, others performed with witnesses, that imitated the rituals of traditional marriage. These arrangements did not alter inheritance or confer rights in the eyes of the law, but they spoke to the human desire for recognition, companionship, and ritual, even when society refused to validate them. These symbolic unions often carried the same features as a standard Roman wedding. There might be an exchange of vows, a banquet attended by friends, or a celebratory gathering marked with music and laughter. The participants, though both men followed the outlines of a ritual designed for husband and wife. To outsiders, these events were easy targets for mockery. Satirists ridiculed them, portraying them as laughable imitations of proper marriage. Yet their very existence reveals a truth often hidden beneath the loud judgments of society. Men sought not only dominance, but also connection, not only indulgence, but also acknowledgement. The contradiction lay in Rome's dual view of sexuality. On one hand, intimacy between men was not condemned if roles were preserved. On the other, the idea of binding that intimacy in ritual unsettled the order. Marriage in the Roman system was more than a union of two individuals. It was a contract between families, a mechanism for inheritance, a tool of lineage and property. To perform marriage outside of those boundaries was to strip it of its function and reveal its deeper meaning, a declaration of belonging. For Rome, that meaning was dangerous. Still, such unions took place. Some were discreet, hidden within the privacy of a villa. Others were bold, with guests attending wine poured and music played, as if the ritual were sanctioned. To those who participated, the ceremony may have offered comfort, a brief taste of recognition in a society that otherwise reduced intimacy to hierarchy. To hold hands before witnesses, to share vows beneath lamplight, to call another by the language of spouse, these gestures mattered, even if the law remained silent. The tension these unions created was evident in how writers responded. Satirists mocked them with biting humor, using them as proof of decadence, as signs of moral decline. Yet the mockery itself proves that the practice was visible, not hidden. If symbolic marriages had been rare or secret, there would have been no need to ridicule them publicly. The laughter, though cruel, is also a kind of acknowledgement. Behind it lies the fact that such unions persisted, defying the silence imposed by Rome's hierarchy. These ceremonies also remind us of the role ritual played in Roman life. The empire was saturated with rites of birth, of death, of war, of peace. To move through life without ritual was almost unthinkable. Even intimacy stripped of recognition by law found its way back into ritual form. Symbolic marriages allowed men to place their desires within the language of tradition, even as they stretched that tradition beyond its legal boundaries. In the frescoes of Pompeii and the graffiti etched into walls, we see hints of these unions. Some images depict pairs of men reclining together, their closeness presented not only as physical but also as social. While such images may not have represented marriage explicitly, they suggest a world where male companionship could be acknowledged visually, even artistically. In this way, art provided a space where ritual and reality could meet. Yet Rome remained uneasy with the idea of equality and intimacy. For a man to marry another man suggested a partnership, and partnership was foreign to the Roman code of dominance. The symbolic unions therefore carried an implicit challenge. They placed two men side by side, not one above the other. This inversion, even if only ceremonial, unsettled the hierarchy that defined Roman virtue. The laughter of satirists was not only humor, it was defense, a way to reinforce the old order by ridiculing what threatened it. Imagine, though, the quiet moments of these unions. Two men standing in a courtyard, lamps flickering on marble walls, friends gathered with cups of wine, the faint sound of pipes in the air. Words of devotion exchanged, promises made, laughter shared. The law may not have recognized it, but the participants did. In that moment, ritual gave shape to desire, and companionship claimed a space within a world that often denied it. The persistence of symbolic marriages tells us something profound about Rome. It shows that even within a culture obsessed with hierarchy, the human longing for recognition could not be erased. Men sought not only to dominate, but also to belong, not only to indulge, but also to affirm bonds. The rituals may have been mocked, the unions dismissed, but they endured, carved into the hidden corners of Roman life. In this way, Rome reveals both its strictness and its flexibility. The law drew hard lines, but human lives moved around them, creating spaces of acknowledgement where none officially existed. Symbolic marriages were not legal contracts, but they were declarations, quiet acts of defiance against a system that equated intimacy solely with power. As the lamps dimmed after such ceremonies as guests departed and silence returned, the participants may have felt both the weight of society's gaze and the comfort of companionship affirmed. Their union might never appear in legal records, but in ritual, in memory, and perhaps even in love, it became real. And so even in Rome, where dominance equaled virtue and hierarchy defined intimacy, men carved out moments of belonging, fleeting yet meaningful through the language of ritual. They remind us that beneath the rigid codes of empire, the human need for recognition endured quietly but persistently in the form of symbolic unions that history could mock but never erase. To step into the cities of ancient Rome, Pompeii, Herculaneum, or the capital itself was to walk through a world where art and intimacy coexisted openly. Erotic imagery was not tucked away in secret corners nor confined to brothels. It appeared on walls in homes, on pottery, in bathhouses, and in taverns. To modern eyes, such openness might seem startling, even scandalous. But to Romans, it was simply part of daily life woven into the fabric of both public and private spaces. In Pompeii especially, excavations reveal frescoes depicting scenes of intimacy painted with the same confidence as mythological battles or pastoral landscapes. These images range in tone from humorous to tender, from erotic to symbolic. Some show couples and embrace others, highlight fertility gods, and still others blur the line between playfulness and devotion. The art does not whisper. It speaks plainly, unapologetically, as though to remind viewers that desire was not shameful, but natural part of existence itself. These frescoes were not restricted to brothels, though brothels displayed them most vividly. They also adorned private homes where families lived. Guests dined and children played. In dining rooms, a visitor might pass a wall painted with scenes of lovers placed deliberately in spaces meant for conversation and entertainment. In bedrooms, walls often carried images of intimacy surrounding sleep, with reminders of desire. Even bathhouses, where men and women gathered in shifting states of undress, featured mosaics and paintings that combined the everyday with the erotic. To Romans, such imagery could carry multiple meanings. Some believed the images acted as protection, warding off bad fortune or the evil eye. Others saw them as offerings to fertility gods meant to bless households with abundance. Still others viewed them simply as decoration, a celebration of pleasure and humor. The intent mattered less than the fact that such images were accepted, displayed without secrecy, as part of the rhythm of life. The variety of the imagery is striking. Some scenes lean toward comedy, exaggerating anatomy, or staging humorous encounters that would have drawn laughter as much as arousal. Others carry tenderness, showing lovers gazing into each other's eyes or embracing gently. Still others are overtly ritualistic, invoking deities or blending human and divine figures. The sheer range reflects the complexity of Roman attitudes. Desire could be playful, sacred, or casual, but rarely hidden. One motto captures the Roman approach: everything is allowed, but only if the right person does it. This philosophy extended into art. Erotic imagery was acceptable so long as it reflected established hierarchies' dominance above submission below. A freeborn man could be depicted in command, a god towering above mortal lovers, a husband reclining as a wife approached. What mattered was not the act itself, but the roles portrayed. Even an art hierarchy remained intact, and yet the presence of these images in public spaces suggests a kind of acceptance far beyond hierarchy. To Romans, the body was not taboo. It was part of nature, a subject for art like any other. Where modern societies often separate the erotic from the artistic, Rome blended them seamlessly. A wine jug might carry scenes of intimacy passed around a table as guests drank and laughed. An oil lamp might bear the image of lovers casting light in a household chamber. To Romans, beauty, humor, and desire belong together. This openness challenges modern expectations. In many cultures today, erotic imagery is restricted, labeled, or hidden. For Romans, it was part of education, conversation, and ritual. A child could grow up seeing such images daily, learning about life not from abstract stories, but from the walls of their own home. To them, there was no contradiction in mixing philosophy with play worship with desire or art with intimacy. The discovery of these frescoes centuries later shocked early archaeologists. In the 18th and 19th centuries, many of the more explicit images from Pompeii and Herculaneum were locked away in so-called secret cabinets, accessible only to scholars or select visitors. What Romans had displayed openly later generations tried to hide, reflecting the different moral codes of their time. The frescoes remind us that what one age considers shameful, another may accept as natural. Imagine walking through a Roman villa, its walls painted in deep reds and golds, its floors patterned in mosaics of myth and daily life. In one room you might see Hercules wrestling lions. In another, a couple in embrace. The transition is seamless, as though heroism and intimacy belonged side by side. Guests reclining at dinner might turn their eyes from a bowl of fruit to a fresco of lovers without discomfort or surprise. It was all part of the same world, human, divine, and natural, bound together in art. This artistic openness also served as a mirror of society's values. By portraying intimacy so casually, Rome revealed its priorities. Desire was not feared, weakness was. Acts were not condemned, roles were. The art reflected the same truth lived daily in homes and streets. Everything flowed through hierarchy, but within that structure, much was permitted. And yet these images also carried subtler meanings. Some scholars believe certain frescoes functioned as talismans. Their explicitness meant to protect, rather than to provoke. Others argue that they expressed humor, a way of mocking human folly and exaggerating desire. Still others see them as affirmations of fertility, reminders of life's continuity. Whatever the purpose, the presence of such imagery in both public and private spaces underscores its central place in Roman culture. Today, visitors to Pompeii and Herculaneum can still see these frescoes. Their colors, preserved by volcanic ash, remain vivid. Their lines still carry the confidence of artists who saw no need to disguise or soften the human form. Tourists react with surprise laughter or discomfort responses that reveal more about modern sensibilities than about Roman ones. For the people who lived there, these images were not unusual. They were part of the air they breathed, as ordinary as a statue of a god or a mosaic of a harvest. The frescoes remind us that Rome, for all its grandeur, was a society deeply at ease with the body. Where we draw lines between art and eroticism, they saw continuity. Where we divide the sacred and the sensual, they blended them. And where we expect shame, they painted celebration. In the end, erotic art in Rome was not about secrecy. It was about visibility, about weaving desire into the fabric of daily life. It reflected a culture where intimacy was not confined to private whispers, but carved into walls, painted onto pottery, and illuminated in the glow of lamps. It was a world where beauty, humor, ritual, and desire all shared the same canvas. In the Roman imagination, the army was more than a fighting force. It was a reflection of the empire itself, ordered, disciplined, unyielding. To maintain such an image, the soldiers' lives were regulated not only in matters of marching, training, and fighting, but also in matters of intimacy. For the legionnaire, even desire was subject to discipline. The code was simple yet absolute. A Roman soldier was forbidden from appearing weak. On the battlefield, that meant never retreating without command. In the camp, it meant enduring hardship without complaint. And in matters of sexuality, it meant never taking a role that might suggest submission. The army did not forbid relations between men outright, but it dictated the manner in which they could occur. To yield to play the passive role was incompatible with the image of a soldier. A man who wore armor, who carried Rome's standards, could not be seen as yielding in body or spirit. This rule reflected the larger Roman equation. Dominance equaled virtue, submission equaled weakness. For the legion, the stakes were higher. A passive soldier, it was feared, might carry his softness into battle. A man who accepted subordination and intimacy might falter. Under the weight of the shield, might hesitate in the clash of steel. The connection may seem illogical to us, but to Rome, the body and the battlefield were inseparable. Discipline had to be absolute, extending even into the most private of spaces. The regulations were not merely theoretical. Records describe punishments for soldiers accused of violating this unspoken code. Accusations of passivity could strip a man of honor, reduce his standing, or even lead to dismissal. In some cases, satire and rumor served as unofficial enforcers. To mock a soldier for softness was to question his courage, and in a culture where reputation mattered as much as ability, such whispers could ruin a career. The contradiction, of course, lay in the army's tolerance for other forms of indulgence. A soldier could visit brothels, take slaves for pleasure, or even pursue relationships with camp followers, so long as he remained the active partner. The empire did not police desire itself, it policed roles. A soldier might be praised for his vigor, admired for his appetite, provided that his behavior reinforced rather than undermined the image of dominance. The double standard extended beyond the camp. In literature, poets mocked politicians or philosophers accused of softness, yet rarely condemned soldiers for indulgence provided they maintained their role. Military discipline was not about morality. It was about image, about ensuring that every legionnaire embodied the empire's demand for strength. Imagine a Roman camp at dusk, tents set in perfect rows, the smell of smoke rising from cooking fires, the murmur of soldiers sharing food and stories. Behind the order, desire simmered quietly, yet always within the boundaries Rome demanded. To step outside those lines was not only a personal risk, but a threat to the collective image of the legion. In this way, the army became not only a school of war, but also a school of restraint, shaping men's bodies and their desires into tools of empire. The rigidity of this system bred hypocrisy. Men who condemned same-sex relations in words might indulge in them in private, provided they concealed the role they played. Officers who demanded discipline from their troops might themselves seek out pleasures that contradicted their own rules, confident that their rank would shield them from accusation. The gap between appearance and reality was wide, but appearance was what mattered most. This obsession with image reveals much about Roman values. The empire thrived on control of land, of people, of resources. The army was its sharpest tool, and that tool had to appear flawless. Any hint of weakness was seen as dangerous not only for the individual, but for the empire as a whole. By tying sexual discipline to military honor, Rome ensured that even desire was conscripted into service of the state. Yet beneath this control, one can imagine the strain it created. Young men far from home living in the strict order of camp life must have felt the tension between human longing and military expectation. Their bodies, subject to endless marches, harsh training, and rigid codes, also carried unspoken desires. Some found outlets in acceptable forms: visits to brothels, relationships with slaves. Others carried their silence like another weight alongside their shields. The discipline that bound the army together also bound the individual in solitude. The fear of appearing weak extended into rituals of punishment. Soldiers caught in acts deemed dishonorable faced not only dismissal but public humiliation. To strip a man of his armor, to flog him before his peers, to reduce him from warrior to object of ridicule, these were the methods Rome used to preserve the army's image. The punishment was not about the act itself, but about ensuring the performance of dominance remained unbroken. And so, the Roman legion marched not only with swords and shields, but with rules that reached into every private act. The discipline that allowed Rome to conquer nations also demanded silence and intimacy. Soldiers lived within a system where desire was permitted only when framed as power, where weakness was punished, and where, even in the quiet of the night, under the stars of distant provinces, a man had to guard not only his life but his reputation. The story of military rules and sexual discipline reveals more than regulation. It shows the empire's deep anxiety, the fear that softness, tenderness, or yielding might unravel the order Rome had built. The legion's symbols of might had to embody the same equation that governed the empire itself. To dominate was to live with honor. To yield was to court disgrace. As dawn rose over Roman camps' drums, beating soldiers tightening their belts and shouldering their shields, the lesson was clear. Their bodies were not their own. They belonged to Rome, disciplined, ordered, and guarded against any hint of weakness. Even desire, the most private of impulses, was conscripted into the service of the state. In Rome, power was not carried only by swords or sealed in decrees. It also lived in words. The empire that built aqueducts and conquered nations also nurtured a class of writers whose sharpest tool was not steel but satire. These poets and satirists, men like Martial and Juvenal, turned rumor into art and ridicule into political weaponry. Their verses did not simply amuse. They could wound, unseat, and destroy. The Roman elite lived under constant scrutiny. A senator might rise in the forum with all the dignity of his office, only to find himself mocked in taverns or whispered about in bathhouses. A philosopher might write treatises on virtue, but one biting line of satire could paint him as a hypocrite for generations. Such was the power of wit in a culture where reputation mattered as much as deeds. Satirists thrived on this vulnerability, crafting words that made men tremble more than swords. What gave satire its edge was Rome's obsession with roles. To suggest that a man of standing had stepped into a submissive role sexually, politically, or socially was to strike at his very identity. A senator accused of softness, a general mocked for indulgence. A philosopher teased for secret lovers, all found their reputations chipped away by verse. The truth of the accusation mattered less than its circulation. In Rome, rumor dressed as poetry could undo a man's career. Martial, for example, filled his epigrams with playful cruelty. He named names, turned personal habits into punchlines, and mocked rivals with precision. Juvenal's satires dripped with bitterness, targeting corruption, hypocrisy, and moral weakness. Their audiences laughed, but beneath the laughter ran currents of fear. Every man who heard the verses knew that tomorrow's target might be himself. To laugh too loudly was to risk suspicion. To ignore the lines was to seem complicit. The Senate itself was not immune. Whispered jokes about an official's preferences could weaken his voice in debate. A poem insinuating softness could tarnish years of service. The very fact that men of power responded sometimes with anger, sometimes with bribery, sometimes with exile, proves how seriously satire was taken. In a city where authority depended on performance, words could unmask, or at least appear to unmask, the actor behind the mask. Even emperors felt the sting. Though their position placed them above ordinary men, their reputation still hung in the balance of rumor. Tales of indulgence, whispers of shameful acts versus mocking their private lives. These spread quickly, carried by the same poets who claimed to entertain but often sought to influence. Caligula, Nero, Domitian all found themselves immortalized not only by their actions, but by the ridicule of writers whose words outlasted marble. The satirists, of course, walked a dangerous line. To mock too boldly was to invite retaliation. Yet many survived, protected by their wit and the popularity of their work. Their verses were repeated at banquets, scratched into walls as graffiti passed from hand to hand like currency. In this way, satire became a form of public power, available not only to the elite but to ordinary citizens who laughed, repeated, and spread the lines. Consider the atmosphere of a Roman dinner party. Guests reclining on couches, wine-poured lamps glowing softly against painted walls. A poet recites verses, the room erupts with laughter, and in that laughter a rival's name is tarnished. The words linger long after the feast, repeated the next morning in the forum, the bathhouse, the market. What began as entertainment becomes reputation, and reputation becomes destiny. For women, satire worked differently. Since they were already bound by expectations of silence and modesty, satirists rarely bothered to critique their political influence directly. Instead, they mocked wives suspected of boldness, daughters rumored to stray matrons, accused of secret indulgence. The words reinforced the narrow roles assigned to women, reducing them to symbols of vice or virtue. Even in ridicule, they were denied complexity, their voices silenced by the laughter of men. This culture of satire reveals Rome's uneasy relationship with truth. A verse could topple a man's honor without proof. A rumor once set to meter became immortal. Writers wielded their pens like daggers, blurring the line between entertainment and accusation. and yet society embraced it. Romans accepted that words could wound as effectively as weapons. They laughed even as they feared being next. The impact of satire on politics was profound. It kept leaders in check not through law but through humiliation. It created an atmosphere where appearances mattered even more, where every gesture, every relationship, every rumor was weighed against the fear of ridicule. A man might command armies pass laws or build monuments, but one mocking line could stain his name forever. Imagine a senator returning home after hearing his name mocked in juveniles' lines. He sits in silence, the laughter of others echoing in his mind. His marble statues may still stand, his villa still gleam, but his dignity has been shaken. The wound is invisible, but it lingers, carried in whispers that cannot be silenced. Such was the quiet violence of satire in Rome. In the end, the satirists remind us that Rome's power was never only about soldiers or senators. It was also about words, about the fragile performance of reputation. Martial and Juvenal, with their sharp tongues, held a mirror to Roman life, reflecting its excesses, hypocrisies, and vulnerabilities. They entertained, but they also exposed, turning laughter into a weapon sharper than any blade. If Roman men lived under the constant gaze of satire and rumor, Roman women lived under something quieter, but just as powerful silence. Their intimacy, their affections, their relationships, whether with men or with women, rarely appeared in the grand accounts of poets, historians, or philosophers. When it did, it was usually dismissed as curiosity, mocked as excess, or reduced to insult. In a society obsessed with roles and hierarchy, women's desires were seen not as dangerous, but as irrelevant. Male writers who preserved most of what we know of Roman life showed little interest in exploring female intimacy seriously. When they mentioned it at all, it was often to belittle. Female-female relations in particular were treated as harmless amusements, curiosities, or even jokes. Without a man present, Roman authors claimed intimacy was incomplete and indulgence without consequence. The arrogance in this assumption is clear. Male desire was the measure, and without it, female love was invisible. This silence does not mean such relationships did not exist. On the contrary, it suggests they were common enough to require dismissal. Satirists occasionally mocked women who loved women, but their tone was less one of outrage than of ridicule. By ignoring or belittling such intimacy, Roman men ensured it posed no threat to their authority. In their eyes, two women together disrupted nothing. It did not challenge the hierarchy because it did not involve the figure who mattered most to them, the freeborn Roman male. When women stepped outside expected boundaries, however, the response was sharper. Ancient texts describe women who dressed as men, who pursued lovers boldly, who refused the silence expected of them. These figures were remembered not with admiration, but with mockery or fear. Their stories survive only through hostile voices framed as warnings of excess or examples of shame. The real women behind these fragments remain unseen. Their choices, their desires, their reasons are lost, filtered through pens determined to reduce them. The irony is striking. Rome, so open in its depiction of male desire, so unashamed in its frescoes and festivals, grew quiet when it came to women's passions. A brothel wall in Pompeii might show male lovers with ease, but scenes of female-female intimacy are scarce, and when they appear, they are often exaggerated or comic. The imbalance reveals a deeper truth. Roman culture did not fear women's intimacy because it did not value it. To them, women's relationships lacked the potential to disrupt the carefully drawn hierarchy of power. And yet, absence is not the same as insignificance. Behind the silence, one can imagine the lives of Roman women unfolding with complexity. In courtyards and gardens and whispered conversations at the loom in the privacy of bedchambers, bonds must have formed friendships that deepened affections that grew loves that endured quietly. The record may not preserve them, but the human heart, even under Rome's weight, surely found ways to speak. Occasionally fragments break through. In satire, women are mocked for being too bold in love. In philosophy, they are mentioned as curiosities. In rumor, they are framed as dangerous when they resist their roles. These glimpses, though distorted, suggest that women's intimacy was not absent, only ignored or filtered through ridicule. It is telling that Rome, a culture that prided itself on recording every detail of conquest and governance, left so little space for women's voices. Silence was itself a form of control. The household structure reinforced this dismissal. A wife's role was defined by obedience, modesty, and fertility. Her intimacy was expected to flow only toward her husband, not because of affection, but because of duty. Any love outside that framework, whether with another man or with another woman, fell outside the script. For men, such deviations were tolerated if hidden. For women, they were erased, dismissed as either harmless or shameful. In either case, they were denied legitimacy. Consider the life of a Roman matron. By day, she managed servants, supervised the household, raised children. Her presence was expected but quiet, her behavior measured by neighbors and family alike. To show independence was to risk gossip. To seek intimacy on her own terms was to step into danger. And yet within the silence, she may have found comfort in the company of another woman, a friend, a confidant, a lover. The absence of such stories in history does not mean they never happened. It means they were lived beyond the gaze of men who chose not to write them. When women did break through the silence, the reaction was swift. Julia, the daughter of Augustus, became infamous for her affairs. Her story is preserved not as testimony to her desires, but as evidence of her father's severity. She was exiled. Her lovers punished her name, tarnished. The lesson was clear: a woman's intimacy belonged to her family and her state, not to herself. To claim it was to challenge Rome's order, and the punishment was exile, shame, or worse. And yet, even in exile, even in ridicule, women's presence endured. Their stories survived, if only in fragments, because they could not be erased entirely. Satirists mocked them precisely because they existed. Writers dismissed their intimacy precisely because it was real enough to notice. The silence of the records is not emptiness, it is a shadow cast by lives that resisted, however quietly, the roles imposed on them. In the end, Rome's treatment of women's intimacy reveals as much about the empire's anxieties as it does about women themselves. Men feared weakness in their own roles. They dismissed intimacy among women because it threatened nothing they valued. Power defined virtue, and women denied power were denied recognition of their desires. Yet their lives were lived nonetheless in courtyards and gardens and whispers and glances and bonds that history chose not to honor. As night fell over Roman homes, lamps glowing faintly against frescoed walls, women moved quietly through chambers, their lives unrecorded. History may not preserve their voices, but the silence itself speaks. It reminds us that beneath the empire's marble and might, countless stories were lived, and lost stories of affection, dismissed of intimacy, ignored of love that endured quietly in the shadows of Rome. Roman society placed women within narrow corridors of expectation to be silent, to be modest, to be obedient, to serve as daughters, wives, and mothers. Their roles were bound not only by household authority, but also by the weight of law and custom. Yet even within these confines, some women refused to remain invisible. Their stories, though, often filtered through the hostile pens of male writers, reveal acts of defiance, quiet and bold, that unsettled the Roman order. Ancient texts mention women who dressed as men, who claimed freedoms reserved for their brothers and husbands. To step into male attire was not merely a change of clothing. It was an act heavy with meaning. It suggested authority, independence, even rebellion. Such women were ridiculed, their behavior framed as unnatural, but the very fact that they were remembered tells us how deeply their choices unsettled Roman ideals. Clothes in Rome were not fabric alone, they were symbols. A woman in a man's tunic blurred boundaries the empire wanted to keep firm. Other women defied expectations by pursuing lovers openly, whether men or women. Roman authors rarely gave them voices of their own. Instead, they appear as caricatures exaggerated for mockery. Yet behind the ridicule lies evidence of boldness. To take initiative in love was to step outside the role of obedience. To pursue passion was to claim ownership of the body Rome insisted belonged to father, husband, or state. Even when mocked, these women broke the silence, refusing to be confined by duty alone. Some were feared rather than mocked. Writers described women who wielded influence in politics, who whispered advice to powerful men, who maneuvered within the shadows of power. Their presence threatened the fragile balance of Roman gender roles. If a woman could command loyalty, if she could move opinion, what did that mean for the system that defined virtue as male dominance? Fear sharpened into hostility, and such women were portrayed as schemers, temptresses, or dangers to the state. The most famous example is Julia, daughter of Augustus. Her affairs became the subject of scandal, her choices remembered, less for their passion than for the punishment they brought. Exiled by her own father, she became a warning to all women who might consider stepping beyond prescribed boundaries. Yet the severity of her punishment reveals the strength of her defiance. Julia lived her life in ways Rome could not ignore, and so Rome silenced her by force. Others resisted more subtly. Some women wrote poetry, though often under male pseudonyms. Others hosted salons, gatherings where conversation could flow beyond the domestic. A few engaged in philosophy, stepping into intellectual realms dominated by men. These acts may not sound dramatic, but in a society where women were expected to remain silent, they were significant. To speak to, write to think aloud, was itself an act of resistance. There were also women who sought freedom through disguise. Some sources tell of matrons who slipped into brothel districts, pretending to be prostitutes in order to move more freely. Under this mask, they could walk without escort dress, with boldness, speak with freedom. To modern ears, this may sound contradictory, but for these women, the role of prostitute, considered shameful by society, offered more autonomy than that of wife. By pretending to step down in status, they stepped sideways into space Rome otherwise denied them. Such acts were not without danger. Discovery meant ruin, loss of reputation, exile, or worse. And yet the stories persisted. Satirists mocked them, gossip spread them, rumor exaggerated them. The fascination reveals how much these women disturbed the order. They were remembered not because they were numerous, but because their defiance shone against the backdrop of silence. Even in religion, women found ways to stretch their roles. Some participated in mystery cults, rituals that allowed for greater expression, even leadership. Though these spaces were still shaped by male authority, they offered glimpses of alternative roles of women speaking, leading, performing. To join such cults was to step beyond the rigid household codes, if only for a time. It is important to remember that most women could not afford such risks. The majority lived confined within the expectations of modesty and service, their lives unrecorded. But the few who defied those roles remind us that resistance was possible. Their stories, though distorted by satire and hostility, hint at deeper currents of desire for freedom, of refusal to remain silent, of courage lived in fragments. Imagine a Roman evening, the streets dim with oil lamps, the hum of voices drifting from taverns. In a quiet villa, a woman slips into a different garment, leaving behind the stola of a matron. She steps into the night disguised, moving with freedom she could not claim by day. For a few hours, she lives outside the gaze of neighbors, beyond the authority of her household, in a world where her choices are her own. The risk is immense, but so is the taste of autonomy. These glimpses of defiance do not overturn the weight of Rome's expectations, but they carve cracks in its walls. They remind us that even in the most rigid societies, human desire for freedom endures. Rome silenced women, dismissed their intimacy, punished their boldness. Yet some resisted by dressing differently, by writing secretly, by loving openly, by moving through the night in disguise. Their lives, half hidden in history, testify to a truth: the empire could not erase women's who claimed space, however fleeting in the vast story of Rome. In the end, their presence lingers like a whisper beneath the marble. Rome wanted women to be silent symbols of obedience. Some, however, refused to be symbols at all. They lived, they defied, and though history preserved them only in fragments, their defiance endures. reminding us that even in the heart of empire, expectation was never absolute. To understand Rome is to recognize that beneath its marble monuments and military triumphs, the empire was haunted by a constant fear. Fear not of enemies or famine alone, but of weakness itself. For Romans, weakness was more terrifying than pain, more shameful than defeat. To be perceived as soft, submissive, or incapable was to lose honor. And in a culture where honor was currency, such a loss could be ruinous. This fear shaped every aspect of Roman life. In politics, a senator's authority rested not only on his ability to speak or legislate, but on his image of strength. Any hint of indulgence could tarnish him. In the military, a soldier's discipline was measured not only by his skill with sword and shield, but by his ability to embody hardness in every gesture, every act. And in the household, a man's dominance over wife, children, and slaves was considered proof of his virtue. To lose control in any sphere was to risk public shame. Nowhere was this obsession clearer than in the realm of intimacy. Roman men did not fear desire itself. They feared what it might say about them. To pursue slaves, concubines, or prostitutes was acceptable provided the man remained in the dominant role. But to be seen in a position of submission, especially with another man, was devastating to one's reputation. The act itself mattered little. It was the role that defined honor. In this way, Rome turned private intimacy into a public stage. Every act weighed for what it revealed about strength or weakness. The fear of weakness extended into art and literature. Poets like Martial and Juvenal used satire to accuse rivals of softness, mocking them as effeminate, passive, or indulgent. Such accusations were political weapons capable of ending careers. A man mocked for yielding in love could find his authority questioned in the Senate or the battlefield. Even emperors who stood above the law were vulnerable to rumor. Their monuments might project power, but a clever verse could whisper weakness into their legacies. In daily life, this anxiety shaped behavior. Men guarded their gestures, their speech, their laughter. Too much softness, too much openness could be read as weakness. A tender embrace might be misinterpreted. A gentle tone could raise suspicion. The need to perform dominance was constant, exhausting, and unforgiving. Virtue was not measured in compassion or honesty, but in hardness unbending, unyielding, always in control. Women lived within a parallel system. Their fear was not of appearing weak, but of appearing too strong. A woman who stepped beyond modesty, who claimed her own desires, who acted with boldness, threatened the balance. For men, strength equaled virtue. For women, submission equaled virtue. In both cases, the fear of stepping outside one's role shaped behavior, enforced not only by law, but by gossip, satire, and silent expectation. The military codified this fear most starkly. Soldiers were forbidden from passive sexual roles not out of moral concern, but because submission was seen as incompatible with discipline. A legionnaire who yielded in love was thought unfit for war. The connection may seem strange, but to Rome it was logical. The body and the battlefield were mirrors. A man who yielded in one would yield in the other. Discipline demanded not only physical endurance, but also the refusal of submission in any form. This fear bred hypocrisy. Men who condemned others for weakness often indulged secretly, hiding behind their rank or reputation. Emperors notorious for indulgence still projected images of strength in public. Senators mocked rivals for softness even as they pursued hidden pleasures. The culture allowed indulgence so long as it was concealed or framed as dominance. The true shame was not in the act, but in the appearance of yielding. Imagine the tension this created in daily life. A man reclines at a banquet surrounded by guests, careful to display ease without softness, confidence without vulnerability. He laughs at jokes, but not too freely. He speaks with authority, never hesitation. Every gesture is measured, for every eye watches. Every ear listens, every whisper could become satire. Beneath the surface lies fear, the fear that one misstep, one rumor, one verse might brand him weak. Even in art, this fear is visible. Frescoes from Pompeii show scenes of intimacy, but always with clear hierarchies, one figure dominant, the other yielding. Sculpture and coinage depict emperors as strong, commanding, never vulnerable. Literature praises conquest, mocks tenderness, glorifies hardness. The cultural record itself reflects the anxiety of weakness, turning every image into reinforcement of Rome's demand for control. The tragedy of this system was the loss of tenderness. By equating weakness with shame, Rome left little room for gentleness, affection, or equality. Relationships were framed in terms of power, not partnership. Desire flowed freely, but always downstream of dominance. Moments of genuine connection surely existed between husbands and wives, between lovers, between friends, but history records them rarely overshadowed by the louder demand for performance. This fear of weakness did not vanish with Rome. In some ways, it still lingers in modern societies where men are judged by strength. Women by modesty and vulnerability is often mistaken for failure. Rome's obsession with dominance set patterns that echo through centuries, shaping ideas of gender honor and power. The anxiety that tenderness equals weakness, that compassion equals failure, still whispers beneath the surface of human life. As night fell over the empire, lamps glowing against frescoed walls, men and women alike carried these fears into their homes. A senator feared rumor. A soldier feared disgrace. A wife feared punishment. A daughter feared silence. Rome built its empire on strength, but beneath that strength lay constant fear. Fear of weakness, fear of shame, fear of stepping outside the roles that bound them all. And so in the quiet of Roman night, behind the marble and the grandeur, lived a people haunted not only by enemies beyond their borders, but by the relentless demand to perform strength, to avoid shame, to fear weakness above all. When we look back at Rome with its frescoes of lovers, its laws about marriage, and its endless debates about honor, it is tempting to see a world wholly removed from our own. And yet, as the dust of centuries settles, the echoes grow clear. Rome's fears, its anxieties, its contradictions about intimacy and power still live with us today. The costumes have changed, the stages are different, but the script feels eerily familiar. Consider the Roman motto, "Everything is allowed, but only if the right person does it." This principle defined their sexual culture, but it also shaped their politics, their society, their very sense of justice. A freeborn man could pursue his desires without consequence, so long as he remained dominant. A senator could indulge in pleasures that would ruin a commoner. An emperor could make scandal a spectacle and still be revered. The double standard was not hidden, it was expected. Today, we may not carve such logic into stone, but whispers of it remain. Who is forgiven for excess and who is condemned? Who bends rules with impunity and who pays dearly for a single misstep? The Romans did not fear love between men. They feared weakness. They did not fear indulgence. They feared loss of status. That pattern endures. In modern societies, debates about gender roles, reputation, and strength often reveal the same unease. A man may be judged less for whom he loves than for how he appears strong or soft, dominant or submissive. A woman may still be scrutinized more for her reputation than for her choices. The details differ, but the anxiety feels the same. Do not be seen as weak. Do not stray from the script. This continuity can be unsettling. It reminds us that the burdens of Rome did not vanish when its empire fell. They seeped quietly into later cultures carried through language, law, and custom. Even today, the idea that masculinity means hardness, that femininity means silence, that power must be displayed through control rather than care, continues to shape expectations. Rome's fear of weakness still whispers through centuries, teaching generations to mistake tenderness for failure. And yet the comparison is not only heavy, it also reveals resilience. Just as Roman women found ways to resist by disguising themselves, by writing poetry in secret, by claiming space in salons, so too do people today resist roles that feel too narrow. The hunger for recognition, for freedom, for love on one's own terms is timeless. Rome tried to silence it, but it persisted. Modern societies wrestle with the same questions, but the persistence of resistance remains. Think of Hadrian and Antinous. Their story, carved into marble minted into coins preserved across centuries, shows both Rome's contradictions and its humanity. Hadrian the emperor could display his love openly because his role was dominant. Antinous the youth was memorialized not as a partner, but as a beloved subordinate, elevated only after death. And yet in their bond, we glimpse something real, a grief so deep that it demanded monuments, a love so strong it could not be hidden. Rome framed it in hierarchy, but the tenderness still shines through. Modern readers see in their story not only power but also affection, reminding us that even in a world of strict roles, love found ways to leave its trace. Modern parallels extend beyond love. The Romans used satire as a political weapon, turning rumor into poetry, ridicule into destruction. Today, public figures live under the gaze of social media, where a single joke, a single rumor can undo years of reputation. The form has changed from scroll to screen, from verse to tweet, but the effect is strikingly similar. Public laughter remains one of the most dangerous tools of politics. The same applies to art. Roman homes displayed erotic frescoes, openly weaving intimacy into daily life. Today's societies draw sharper boundaries between art and intimacy, but the debate continues. What should be hidden? What should be displayed? What belongs in the museum? What belongs in the home? What belongs in the shadows? Rome answered differently, but the questions remain alive. In reflecting on these parallels, we see not only continuity, but also change. Where Rome dismissed women's intimacy as irrelevant, modern voices work to recover and honor those stories. Where Rome demanded silence, modern societies debate, argue, and resist. Progress has been uneven, fragile, often incomplete, but it exists. The very act of comparing ourselves to Rome reveals a willingness to question what once seemed natural. Imagine a Roman walking through a modern city. He might marvel at skyscrapers and electricity, but he would recognize the conversations. Debates about gender roles, about marriage, about who is allowed freedom and who is constrained, these would sound familiar. He would see echoes of his own anxieties in ours. And perhaps we, walking through the ruins of Rome, feel the same. We see in their frescoes, their laws, their laughter, the shadows of our own struggles. The fear of weakness, the hunger for recognition, the tension between control and freedom. These are not Roman alone, they are human. Rome magnified them, carved them into stone, painted them on walls, inscribed them in law. But the echoes continue whispering through time, reminding us that empires rise and fall, but human anxieties endure. As the night deepens and lamps burn low, one can imagine a Roman senator and a modern politician sitting side by side, both guarded in speech, both aware of reputation, both wary of satire, both carrying the fear of weakness. Across centuries, they share the same silence, the same performance. And perhaps too, in some quiet corner, a Roman woman and a modern one share the same glance, the same defiance, the same whisper of resistance. The parallels remind us that history is not only about difference, it is also about continuity. Rome's anxieties did not vanish. They flowed into the currents of human life, shaping the ways we still think about power, intimacy, and shame. To reflect on Rome is to reflect on ourselves, to see in their fears the outlines of our own, and in their silences the voices we still strain to hear. Rome celebrated power in every corner of its culture. In politics and war, in the household, in the bedroom, the same lesson repeated: dominance was virtue, submission was shame. Yet in this relentless pursuit of control, something softer was often pushed aside: tenderness. The ability to show affection freely, to meet another as an equal, to cherish, rather than command, rarely found space in Roman life. The structure of intimacy in Rome was built upon hierarchy. A man might take lovers male or female, but he was expected always to be the active, dominant figure. To yield even in private was to risk public disgrace. A wife was expected to be loyal, modest, and fertile, her role defined not by companionship, but by duty. Slaves and concubines existed to serve their affections irrelevant. Within this system, tenderness, mutual care, equality affection without hierarchy had little place. That does not mean tenderness never existed. Human hearts, after all, cannot be reduced entirely to roles. Moments of gentleness must have unfolded in homes and gardens, in whispered conversations, in embraces away from watchful eyes. But these moments were not the ones Rome chose to celebrate. Its poets, its satirists, its lawmakers preferred to speak of conquest, desire, and dominance. Love, if acknowledged, was framed as obsession, devotion, or possession, not as mutual partnership. The art of the time reflects this imbalance. Frescoes in Pompeii show lovers in embrace, but often the emphasis lies on roles, not on connection. One figure dominates, the other submits. Even in laughter or playfulness, hierarchy remains clear. Sculpture and literature echo the same message: intimacy as a performance of power, not a space for tenderness. What tenderness survived did so quietly in spaces the public eye could not reach. Consider Roman marriage. For many couples, it was a contract of families, a union forged for lineage, wealth, and status. A husband and wife could share a household for decades without closeness. Their lives, though bound by duty, might run in parallel. He in public life, she in the inner quarters managing children and servants. The expectation of tenderness was absent. Letters from the period when they mention wives at all speak more of property, inheritance, and duty than of love. And yet behind this structure, one can imagine the hunger that must have lingered. Women confined to silence, men, bound by the performance of strength, both may have longed for moments of softness. A soldier returning from campaign, a wife watching children grow, a slave dreaming of freedom. Each carried feelings unrecorded, uncelebrated, but no less real. The absence of tenderness in public discourse does not mean its absence in private life, but it shows how little value society placed upon it. The loss of tenderness was not accidental. It was the price of Rome's obsession with hierarchy. To value tenderness would have been to admit equality, and equality unsettled the system. If a man could meet another man as an equal in love, what would that say about dominance? If a husband cherished his wife as a partner, what would that say about the authority of fathers and husbands? Tenderness threatened the very foundations of Roman order, so it was dismissed, ignored, or mocked. This absence shaped generations. Children grew up learning not to value softness. Boys were taught to be hard to dominate, to fear yielding. Girls were taught to be silent, obedient vessels for duty rather than affection. The lessons of hierarchy seeped into the family as deeply as into the Senate or the battlefield. Tenderness was not taught. It was left to emerge in hidden spaces, if at all. There were exceptions. Some poets, like Catullus before the empire's height, wrote verses that capture glimpses of affection lines to lovers that feel tender rather than possessive. But even these were tinged with jealousy, obsession, or power. Few lines in Roman literature celebrate mutual care without dominance. The language of love remained entwined with hierarchy. Imagine a Roman home at night. The lamps burn low, the streets outside fall quiet, and within the villa, silence settles. A husband reclines weary from the day's affairs. A wife moves softly through the chambers, her presence expected but rarely acknowledged. Perhaps in that quiet there is a moment of closeness, a hand brushed against another, a shared glance, a sigh of weariness met with comfort. Such moments existed, but they were fragile, fleeting, and unrecorded. History remembers conquest, not comfort. The loss of tenderness is one of Rome's quieter tragedies. It reveals not only how the empire treated intimacy, but also how it shaped human connection itself. By equating love with power, Rome diminished the possibility of equality in relationships. By glorifying dominance, it left little space for gentleness. What tenderness endured had to survive in silence, hidden from poets, lawmakers, and satirists who preferred the language of conquest. And yet, even in its silence, tenderness matters. It reminds us that beneath the marble and the hierarchy, Rome was made of people who longed, who cared, who suffered when affection was denied. Their stories are mostly lost, but their absence speaks volumes. For every marble statue of a conqueror, there must have been countless unrecorded embraces, whispered words, and quiet moments of comfort. In the end, Rome teaches us not only about power, but also about its cost. The empire's fear of weakness, its obsession with hierarchy, created strength that conquered nations but left intimacy impoverished. Tenderness was not celebrated, but it endured quietly like water seeping through stone. Its absence in the record does not erase its presence in life. It only reminds us of how much was lost when hierarchy overshadowed humanity. In the great expanse of the Roman Empire, women carried a burden that was heavy yet invisible. It was not only the weight of duty as wives, mothers, and daughters, it was also the silence pressed upon them from birth, a silence that demanded obedience, modesty, and restraint. To remain quiet was praised as virtue. To speak too boldly, to act too freely, was to risk shame, exile, or ruin. The cost of this silence, emotional, social, and personal, was immense. From the moment of girlhood, expectations were taught through gestures, stories, and examples. A daughter was told to lower her eyes, to soften her voice, to obey her father without question. Marriage came early, often arranged before maturity, and the lessons continued. A wife was expected to bear children, especially sons, and to manage the household in dutiful quiet. Her worth was measured in her fertility and in her loyalty, not in her words or her desires. The silence was not passive. It was enforced, praised, and constantly watched. Roman law enshrined this silence. A woman's body was not her own. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband, and ultimately to the state. Her fidelity was framed not as personal choice, but as the cornerstone of family honor and civic stability. To step outside the role assigned to her was to endanger more than herself. It was to cast a shadow over her entire household. A rumor of infidelity could damage her father's reputation, her husband's career, even her son's futures. In this way, silence became a form of protection, but also a prison. The double standard was plain. A man could pursue pleasure with slaves, prostitutes, or concubines, and society accepted it. A woman who strayed even in rumor faced disgrace or punishment. Adultery for men was indulgence. For women, it was a crime. The silence demanded of women was not only about speech, but about desire. To express longing, to choose a lover, to step beyond boundaries was forbidden. The cost of silence was the erasure of their inner lives, and yet silence did not mean absence. Women still thought, felt, and resisted, though often quietly. Some wrote poetry, sometimes under male names, to express their emotions. Others carved out space in philosophy salons or religious practices. A few, like Julia, the daughter of Augustus, lived boldly and paid the price. But most endured in stillness, their voices unrecorded, their desires unacknowledged. The silence itself became a kind of inheritance passed from mother to daughter, a lesson in survival. Imagine a Roman household at dusk. The husband reclines in the triclinium, sharing food and laughter with companions. In the inner quarters, his wife sits alone, surrounded by children or servants, her life confined to walls she did not choose. Perhaps she longs to read, to write, to speak her mind. But the silence presses upon her, reinforced by fear of gossip, fear of dishonor, fear of losing even the little security she possesses. Her thoughts remain her own, but unspoken, they fade like whispers into the night. The price of silence was also communal. Women were expected not only to keep themselves in check, but to monitor one another. Matrons gossiped, judged, and reinforced the code, ensuring that any who dared to stray were brought back into line. Respectable women became enforcers of respectability, tightening the very chains that bound them. Silence was not just imposed by men. It was policed within the circle of women themselves, creating a culture of mutual surveillance. For those who broke the silence, the consequences were swift. Exile, divorce, public shame, or worse, awaited women accused of stepping beyond their roles. Some were stripped of dowries, others mutilated, their punishment made visible so no one would forget. The silence was therefore not only cultural, but also physical, inscribed upon women's bodies and lives. The cost was not metaphorical, it was lived, suffered, and often final. And yet beneath the silence, traces of defiance remained. Graffiti in Pompeii hints at women's voices, bold and mocking. Fragments of letters suggest wives who loved, who thought who influenced quietly. Satirists mocked bold women precisely because they existed. Their stories may be fragmented, but they reveal that silence was never absolute. Women found ways, however small, to make themselves heard, even if only in whispers carved into stone or scribbled on a wall. The tragedy lies in how much was lost. Imagine the poetry unwritten, the philosophies unspoken, the affections unrecorded, all silenced by the weight of Roman expectations. We know the voices of Cicero, Seneca, Juvenal, Martial, but where are the voices of their wives, their daughters, their sisters? Their absence is the price Rome demanded. A culture rich in monuments and words, but impoverished in tenderness and equality. This silence did not end with Rome. For centuries after, women in many societies inherited the same expectation to be quiet, modest, obedient. The legacy of Rome's silence endured, shaping laws, customs, and traditions across generations. The cost continued, carried not only by Roman women, but by countless others who followed. As we walk today through the ruins of Pompeii or gaze at the marble busts in museums, we see the faces of Roman women carved in stone, their features serene, their mouths closed. The sculptures capture beauty, dignity, modesty, but not voice. The silence is preserved in marble, a reminder of the lives lived behind it. And yet, the very act of remembering them now challenges that silence. To speak of their burdens, to acknowledge their losses, is to give back some measure of voice. Rome demanded silence, but history allows us to listen closely, to imagine the words they were never allowed to say. In the end, the price of silence was not only personal but cultural. Rome conquered lands, built monuments, codified law, but in silencing half its population, it lost countless stories, ideas, and affections. The empire's grandeur hides a profound absence, one felt not in its marble, but in its quiet. And in that quiet, if we listen carefully, we may still hear the echoes of women who longed to speak but were never allowed. Among the marble halls of palaces and the shaded gardens of villas, Rome's most powerful men lived in ways that stretched the limits of indulgence. Their wealth and status insulated them from restraint, granting them freedoms denied to others. With that freedom came a culture of excess where even the most disturbing acts could be justified as entertainment ritual or divine imitation. Power in the Roman elite was not only about governance or war, it was also about how far one could go without consequence. Accounts from historians and satirists describe scenes that today feel unthinkable. Banquets turned into spectacles not of food and laughter alone, but of cruelty, sexuality, and humiliation. The same men who commanded armies or ruled provinces might spend their evenings orchestrating performances that blurred the lines between pleasure and abuse. Their authority shielded them, transforming acts that would disgrace a common man into demonstrations of status. Some emperors became infamous for such indulgences. Caligula, for instance, was accused of forcing noble women to perform publicly, turning the palace into a stage for degradation. Nero was said to enjoy theatrical displays of violence, dressing as an animal, and treating bound victims as prey. Whether exaggerated or not, the persistence of these accounts reveals what mattered. People believed their rulers capable of such acts because the culture itself tolerated indulgence at the top. Shame in these circles was replaced by spectacle. What shocks us now is how openly such excess was displayed. Murals in villas, mosaics in private chambers, even decorative objects celebrated acts of domination and indulgence. Guests at banquets were expected to laugh, admire, or even participate. To object was to risk appearing prudish or weak. Within these elite spaces, excess was not hidden. It was culture. Religion, too, provided cover. In some cults and rituals, sexuality and devotion mingled in ways that blurred boundaries further. Statues of gods with exaggerated features stood in temples. Amulets shaped like male organs were worn for protection. Sexual display could be framed as fertility indulgence as piety. Even acts that shocked outsiders were defended as sacred. Power used belief as its shield-making indulgence seem not only acceptable but divine. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum have revealed rooms adorned with murals of bondage domination and exaggerated fantasies. These spaces were not hidden dungeons, they were part of homes accessible to guests meant to impress rather than conceal. The objects of indulgence were slaves, concubines or others of lower status people whose lack of freedom made their participation inevitable. Their pain or reluctance mattered little. In the eyes of the elite, their role was to serve. The elite's power was reinforced by inequality before the law. A common man caught in an obscene act might be punished, beaten, or shamed. An emperor could call the same act performance and applause would follow. A senator might frame indulgence as ritual and it would be excused. The law itself bent before rank, turning cruelty into entertainment and excess into culture. Philosophers occasionally tried to resist. Stoics like Seneca spoke of self-control, of temperance, of the dangers of indulgence. Yet even Seneca, close to Nero's court, struggled to live by his own words. The roar of the crowd, the laughter of guests, the allure of spectacle drowned out quieter voices of restraint. Rome preferred indulgence to disciplined spectacle to silence. Imagine a lavish Roman banquet. Lamps flicker against marble walls, wine flows endlessly, tables overflow with roasted meats and exotic fruits. Musicians play, dancers move, and in the center of it all, a display unfolds. People paraded, ordered, used. Guests cheer, some with genuine delight, others with forced smiles, all complicit in silence. For those who suffered, there was no escape, no voice, no recognition. For those who indulged, the night was only another performance of power. This culture of excess left scars that echo through history. Rome's legacy is not only aqueducts and roads, but also the reminder that unchecked power warps boundaries. When wealth and status shield the few, indulgence grows into cruelty. What begins as entertainment becomes exploitation. What is framed as ritual becomes abuse. And yet within Rome, it was all tolerated, even admired. The indulgence of the elite also shaped broader society. What emperors did openly, others imitated quietly. The standards of the powerful trickled down, reshaping what was seen as acceptable. A common household could not host a banquet like Nero's, but it could adopt smaller echoes, lavish meals, crude jokes, murals of indulgence. In this way, excess became not only an elite pastime, but a cultural current carried into homes, markets, and festivals. The cost of this indulgence was borne by those with the least power, slaves, concubines. And the young suffered most their lives treated as disposable, their bodies as property. Their names rarely appear in records, their stories left untold. Yet they were the foundation of the spectacle, the silent stage upon which Rome's elite performed their dominance. Their absence in history is itself a testament to how thoroughly indulgence erased humanity. As centuries pass, the stories of excess remain disturbing, yet they also serve as reminders. They show us how power unchecked by law or morality bends culture toward cruelty. They reveal how indulgence celebrated as freedom can become tyranny for those beneath. And they remind us that behind the grandeur of Rome, behind the marble and the glory, lay a darkness built from laughter at another's suffering. When we reflect on Rome's greatness, we must also remember this cost. The roads, the aqueducts, the forums, the laws, all were built alongside a culture of excess that consumed lives. Power without restraint left scars not only on the bodies of the vulnerable, but also on the soul of the empire itself. Rome conquered the world, but within its palaces it also conquered tenderness, replacing it with indulgence that knew no bounds.